Hey, welcome everyone. It's good to have you back. We've got Shannon Desalvo with us today. Shannon is currently in school studying psychology and neuroscience with a focus on consciousness research. She has active membership in the Society of Scientific Exploration, the American Psychological Association, the Science and Medical Network, the Society for Psychical Research, the Parapsychology Association, the Rhine Institute, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, as well as two honor societies. Shannon started moderating the Insiders program for Skinwalker Ranch in June of last year and is currently a moderator on all three of their platforms. And of course, that's where we're going to start, but we always veer off into uncharted territory off the ranch. But let's dive in there and start with, how did you get involved with, well, the Insiders program, but kind of Skinwalker Ranch in general?
So, really interesting story for me, at least, in comparison to talking to other people, how they got involved with sort of being interested in the ranch. I inherited my grandfather's trunk of things a couple of years ago. This is right before the pandemic. And I started going through all of his stuff, and there was lots of pictures. And I found out that he worked at White Sands, and he worked during the period of time where like NASA was founded and all of that stuff. So I got really interested in kind of like diving into his sort of past. And that led me to sort of researching all of that area of the country. So I started with White Sands, and then I moved over and then eventually, because when you're studying that area, you find out that there's this really strange ranch in Utah. And so I read about it first. And then I was like, oh, there's a show on this place. I should check it out. And this is when you know, the pandemic had started. And so there was some time I think everybody binged some TV. And so I started watching it. And I, of course, was one of those people that were like glued to the television with tons of questions. I think my primary original focus, at least, was I thought it was interesting that the ranch seemed to interact differently with different people. And that's sort of like where my focus is, anyways. So I feel like I took a back road to discovering the ranch because I wasn't somebody that really watched History Channel, or I've since gotten into like, I've watched some alternate ancient aliens on because I think it's fascinating with like my little notepad to to like do extra research. But yeah. And now and now I can't imagine, I can't remember what life was like before being involved in the program. Um, it was like late, it wasn't late, it was like mid-May last year. And of course, my like mindset of being the researchy type, every so often I'd look up the ranch just to see if there's new articles and stuff about it. And I saw that they had this new program, and I got really excited and immediately signed up for it. And day one, when I got into the YouTube chat, Eric was in there, and my mind was blown that the Eric Bard from the ranch was just in there talking to people. And I think the rest has now become history.
Well,
That's awesome.
do you want to take a minute? I mean, one of the reasons we really wanted to have you on is so many people have heard of the Insiders, but they don't really know what the Insiders program entails. And
Yeah.
it's a kind of complicated conversation. There's so many different aspects to it. I think one of the more important aspects of the program is the spreadsheet, the infamous spreadsheet, which you started. But maybe if you wouldn't mind kind of briefly running over, what is the Insiders program? What is it? How does it tie into Skinwalker Ranch and, you know, all of the kind of benefits and perks and stuff? I'm sure you've made this spiel a million times.
I never tire of it though, because I'm really passionate about the program. I think it's really exciting. And I think it's funny that you bring up the spreadsheet, because I have a feeling that's going to follow me for the rest of my life. Like that'll be it. It's going to be spreadsheet and Shannon go together. So Originally, back in May when it started, what we were given was essentially inside of the website once you sign up, which is you get a free 1 week trial. And then after that, you can either do monthly, which I think is $10 a month, which is a steal, in my opinion, or I want to say $99 for the whole year. I might be off on that, which I should have had that prepared and I apologize, but I feel like that's about it. I think it's around $100 for the year if you do it up front. And then you get a t-shirt and a membership card and a bunch of other benefits if you decide to do it for the year. But there's some people that, it's better for them to do it month to month, which is great. And we're happy to have people come in because they quickly get addicted to it as well. So when it first started, we had access to the website, and inside of the website, there's a lot of historical data that has been compiled sort of in places. And there's videos the guys have made like on ranch talking about specific things, some private videos that they may have taken with their phones when events have occurred. I think the most important thing to highlight is the fact that you're getting everything that the show doesn't have the opportunity to give you. It's funny because I've in the last year, I've almost forgotten that there is a show because I feel like the content is so much more rich outside of the program. And that's not to say anything negative about the show because I still love it. I still watch it every time it airs, as soon as it's airing. But you get everything that an hour of television that's edited down isn't able to give to you. And by I think the second week, because you can't share anything out of the program. And I'm just going to say this because I think it's important to note that any program that you're paying for membership to, you cannot share outside of it because it defeats the purpose of having a paid membership to a program. So I think that's really, really important where people can access all of this stuff if they've joined, but that's what people are paying memberships for. So we were in the YouTube chat, which is all we really had to communicate with other members at the time. And we were seeing things on the cameras because that's what we get access to, these live cameras that are on the ranch 24/7. They vary kind of dependent on what's happening there at the time. Like right now we have one view, and that is because they are busy doing things that I'm not sure. We just assume that they may be filming, but that hasn't been announced. Like they haven't been renewed for another season. I think I'm safe in saying that. So we're seeing these things happen on the live stream, and we're talking really excitedly in the YouTube chat, but we had no way to record it or share it with each other. Like if I were to have seen something earlier in the day and then somebody comes in, and perhaps the cameras are on sort of like a timer. So after 12 hours, the data is lost. You can only go back so far. So if I wanted to share something with someone, we'd have no way to do that. And I came up with an idea, which is I'm not going to lie to you. I don't love Google Sheets, but it was the only thing that I could create that was like, oh, what can be collaborative that everybody can access and also enter in? Like wasn't owned by one person. So people could go in and add their stuff. And so, but there wasn't that many of us. There was like maybe, I feel like on average, there was maybe like 8 to 15 people a day that were in the YouTube chats. And maybe, it's at the very beginning of the program. And so the spreadsheet was born. It is now a monster. It is a beast. And it's got all of this data that we've collected over the last year and a couple of months. So there's a literal sheet for every single month where people are recording their finds that they're seeing on the live cameras, which we have definitely seen things. Outside of the spreadsheet, we also now have a Facebook page that is only for members, which is a great source of information, but also where people can sort of share stuff. And then we've got our Discord server, which is, I want to say, one of the biggest perks to the program. We did not get that until a couple of months into it. But the reason that that's such an incredible perk is because the team will drop in for voice chats and you'll have the opportunity to actually speak with them. And it's pretty impromptu, it's never planned. But like Eric or Caleb or Thomas, any of them really could show up at any time. And then Eric, for example, has spent hours and hours talking with people and sharing things and allowing people to ask questions and listening to ideas. And it's really, I can't think of a more transparent. I know that the ranch gets accused a lot of not being transparent with their stuff, but the Insiders program gives you access to a ridiculous amount of data. And allows you to participate in the research that's happening there as well, because I know for a fact that they do listen to our ideas. They listen, we have a place in the spreadsheet where you can submit like your theories or your experiment ideas. And I know that they've gone through and looked at the experiment ideas, which is really, I mean, I think is amazing. I can't think of any other place that does something like that. So was that a good spiel?
Yeah. As far as you know,
it rehearsed.
Have they implemented any of the ideas that people have proposed that you're able to talk about?
So there's been a couple of instances where we've specifically asked for things. One thing that we were really interested in, I think a lot of people were, was the rabbi's chant from one of the earlier seasons. And people were really interested to see what would happen if it was played again without him being there. We obviously don't have access to that audio. So that was something that we asked about. And there is video of it now on the website that's been archived, but I think it might have been Halloween. They went out into Homestead 2 and played the rabbi's chant for us. And we were able to watch it and see. And then we also have done some sound experiments out of curiosity, because sound is it's a very interesting element of everything that's happening there, as we've seen even just in this season with Blazing Bear. So there's a little bit of, there's people that are like, oh, is it the sound and the frequency of sound, or is it the intention behind the sound? Is it who's doing it? Is it, so that's a fun thing to explore. I don't know about the other stuff. It's funny because we'll ask sometimes about certain experiments and they won't comment on it. And that's kind of how we know, like they're tied obviously too by their NDAs with the show. So anything that may end up being on camera, we're not going to hear about. We get to hear everything else though.
Now, there was an experiment that I know they talked about in one of the Chips and Salsa, so I think we can safely talk about it, that involved a radiation detector.
Oh yeah.
Now that was something that was organized. Yes, the 33 experiment that was organized through the Discord, wasn't it? Or maybe through the insiders, at least.
It was through the insiders. Was it through Discord? Do we have Discord at that point? It's really hard to think because everything is a big blur now. I think it was though. I think we did have Discord at this point, and yeah, and we do have a spot on the spreadsheet that like sort of chronicles the journey of the 33 experiment, and it was very collaborative. We also had another one, which I think we can talk about too, because I won't go too much into detail with it, but one of them was a pink experiment where we were supposed to like, this was more focused on like intention, because we do have people that organize these things where it's like sort of a collaborative intention group. They call them focus groups, where like people are focusing on the same thing together. And so they took it a little like one step further per conversation with the team. And it was, everybody was supposed to think pink for like 24 hours. And we did see pink show up in the Mesa this season, which would have been, from what we've been told, took place at the exact same time that we were doing this experiment. To know if that's, you can't, it's not necessarily correlation, but it was an interesting coincidence. So there's been that. And then, Eric is always asking for, I think when they're done filming, that's really when the program, he's like, well, what can we do? What are some ideas that you guys have? And at one point, we also had a different experiment in the homestead that was sort of around the idea of focused intention as well. So hopefully I'm okay in talking about all of that. I think it's fine though. We're not showing any pictures or anything.
Right. And for those who don't know what we're talking about with the mysterious 33, and correct me if I get any of the details wrong here, but the idea was that people on the insiders group were
Mhm.
supposed to focus on the number 33, and they had a radiation a dosimeter that was
Right.
out taking readings in a fixed location. And when
Yes.
they got it back and they checked the results, what they saw was a standard curve, probability
Hmm.
curve of all the different counts, which is, like how many counts per minute, which is how they measure the radiation with the Geiger counter. And there
Right.
was a hole where 33 should be. There was
That's
zero.
right. It was gone. There was no 33.
Yeah.
Um,
And the
which is
probability of that, they were
really
like,
interesting. Is like
yeah,
in
they
like, yeah,
probably
very.
calculated it out.
And they did do the due diligence of following up to see like, oh, is this brand or what have you? Like, can you even get a 33? Because it was so strange that it was absent from it. So very, very interesting. I don't know what that tells us, but it is very interesting. And it's also awesome that they did it. The fact that and this is something that we didn't see, you're not going to see any other place than within the program, is experiments like that. Like that's not going to show up on the television show, but that's an active experiment that we participated in with the ranch. Like I don't know. To me, and I'm biased at this point, so I can't hide that. But to me, that seems like well worth $10 a month. I know that that's a lot for people, but like if you're really interested in this stuff and you maybe don't have access to some of the equipment or you don't have a way to participate in some of these sort of really neat, I'm not going to use the word paranormal, but anything that kind of encompasses not conventional experiments, it's an awesome way to be able to participate in things. But yeah, gosh, it's been a while. You're pulling. I'm sorry, I wasn't prepared to talk about 33. Me
Oh,
thinking
that's all
back,
right.
it's been a really long time. It feels like a really long time, anyways.
Well, and it's one of the experiments that has been discussed publicly.
Mm-hmm.
So we can talk about it because they talked about it and they released some of those chips and salsa publicly. Um,
Oh, I didn't even
so
realize. Oh, that's good to know.
or did
Um,
they? Dean,
I did it.
step in
I have
here
no, I have no
because
idea.
they were
It wouldn't
posted on our
surprise me if they did.
subreddit. I know
When
they were posted on our subreddit.
yeah, when the Insiders program first started, they were sharing a little bit of that stuff to let people know what they were doing. I think we heard on the Reddit forum about the 33 experiment. And I know you've done a couple other ones where you've got people watching the live feed, and then you're like, I was in one of those where we were trying to get like a basketball to move around in the
Something like
homestead,
that.
something like
Yeah,
that, or light was there had a lamp in there or
that's it.
something.
There was a
Oh,
light
there was a light.
across
Yeah,
the
there you
chair
go.
there. Yeah.
And it was in the day, and I watched the live feed almost every day in my home office. I just have it in the
It's
background, and I saw that in the chat. I lit a little candle with everybody, and we tried to get the light to move, and just remote psi, I guess, is what you're trying to do,
yeah, it's
and
exactly what.
because you've got those live feeds, and I'll tell you, it's audio as well as video. So when you're watching
Mhm.
that, you kind of feel like you're connected to the ranch when you're watching that
for
live feed,
for sure.
and that
Absolutely.
and that alone, I think, is just a lot of fun. Can you tell us a little bit more about the community aspects of this?
Sure.
First of all, when we talked to Brandon last, there was a little over 8,000 members. And I'm
Mm.
assuming you guys it's just growing exponentially because the show's on now, right?
Yeah, and they're running ads for it on the show's commercial break. So it's now being advertised on History Channel during commercial breaks. So
That's
yes, we
fan
are growing
that's fantastic.
exponentially. Yeah.
When I joined the group, it was very, very welcoming.
Oh, good.
I was incredibly welcoming. And it's so fun because you go into that Discord and you have all those different like sub channels,
Hmm.
and you can find so many like-minded people.
Yeah.
I have no access to those kind of people in my daily life, but to go online, it's a wonderful community. I know in some other interviews you've described it as a sort of as a family, but not a family, a collective, but not a collective. It's not the Borg, right?
Right. Well, Eric calls us the collective, and he might be referencing the Borg, but yeah.
Well, that would make you the queen, right?
No, I don't know.
You're the Borg queen, right?
I won't take that title.
Exactly. So that's why I don't want to call it the Borg, right? Because you're not the queen.
Right.
8 of 9.
There you go. How would you describe the community?
We have so I've never been involved in any type of online community before, ever. I'm actually still surprised at myself for in talking in the YouTube chat the first day, and I think I only did it because I realized Eric was in there and I couldn't not, because I'm like, oh my gosh, this might be my only opportunity, not knowing what the future was going to hold. And everybody, again, there was a very small group at the beginning, but I think that we've worked really, really hard to keep the tone of that small group. So even though we've grown so big now, I think we take extra care, the best that we possibly can, to keep the community feeling like it's a close-knit, welcoming place. It makes me so happy to hear when people say that they've come in and they have felt welcomed, because I think one of the biggest challenges in this sort of realm of interests is that, and maybe it's just with any online community, I don't know, I would assume probably so, because I'm not involved in anything else. But I think that you can see a lot of nastiness from people, and that could be for a number of reasons. But that's something that we really work hard to keep out of our group. And I think it's because when people can feel safe and they can feel excited, then they can feel excited. Then they can feel like they can share these things that are really interesting and personal, and quite frankly, like I think it's fascinating to see the types of people that are attracted to the ranch in the first place, because everybody has these really interesting stories. And I think that if we didn't create a space that was welcoming and kind, then they'd be less likely to share it. They would be, we have had people come in and they're like, well, I don't want to be made fun of, or I don't want people to think that I'm crazy or any of that. And we've got this just like really awesome community where it's like nobody's going to think that. Like, even if people do think it, they're not going to say it to you. They're going to be kind, and they want it. People are genuinely interested. And to the point of the Discord having all of these different sort of channels, that's absolutely the case, where you've got people that come in that are interested in the tech aspect of it. They want to know about the equipment that's being used, what equipment's been tried, can they help build something? And we have had community members literally work on stuff that Eric has implemented into things. And then you've got people that are interested in the physics of it, and there's a space for people to talk about that, and not just about specifically the ranch, but sort of what's happening in the world at large, and how pieces of information that we're learning in other places can maybe be applicable to the ranch, or just to be shared with each other. And then you've got people that are interested in the consciousness aspect of it, which I think I probably fall into that camp. And it's really, really cool because, for example, I had, when Bigelow had his big consciousness, like life after deaths contest that he had, and he had like the 25 top papers that came out. I have them all printed out. I have them in a Dropbox folder for myself, but I didn't know anybody that was interested in them. Like nobody cared. That was not that they didn't care, but like it's not a normal topic of conversation like when I'm out in my daily life. So to find people that were really excited to know that I had them, so that I could point them in the direction to them so that we could discuss the papers, that's awesome. Like what a gift that is, to find people that not only are interested in it, but are enthusiastically interested in it, and also very kind about it. So again, I know that not every place is perfect, and I know that as we grow, we might run into problems here and there, but I think that we've done a remarkable job at keeping our collective group, our family, not family, kind and welcoming. And so I do always encourage people that maybe don't know if they want to get involved, or they're nervous about talking the first time because people seem like they've known each other, to just say hi, because everybody's going to be like super welcoming. We'll give you a starter guide. We'll tell you what we say to anybody. Like, if you need anything, that's what we're here for. I say that for myself as somebody that moderates, like I'm always available. We have some other mods that are great, but also just the community of people are going to be helpful too. Everybody wants to see each other happy and like enjoying the program, which is, I think, awesome and rare.
Yeah. Coming from your background, what do you
Yes.
make of the stories and the experiences people have, and how you mentioned earlier how they sort of find out about the ranch and they become very interested in it. It has this incredible draw. We see that on the subreddit. People are on vacation. They want to go to the ranch, right? Some people are dreaming about the ranch at night. They binge watch it. They're thinking about it. They're talking with their families. There's some kind of a hook that gets into people. And aren't you seeing a lot of synchronicity experiences that people have that are bringing them to the ranch? It seems like everybody's got their story, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a really, that to me personally, that's something that like my interests are really kind of on the people that are being drawn there, because I think we're great biosensors. And I think we typically think of a biosensor as being like maybe our physical reactions to things, but I have seen some really interesting sort of psychological responses as a it's fascinating to watch. It really is. And what I think about it, I'm not sure yet, to be honest with you. I think the ranch is it almost works as a magnifying glass for people's interests or intention, or I don't know. I've heard more than one person say that they feel like the ranch is called to them once they've like started, like they can't look away. And it's interesting that you said that you keep it on the background, like in your office, because it's the same with me. Like it's always up. Sometimes I don't even remember that it's in the background until I hear cows mooing. And I'm like, oh, right. Where are those cows coming from? Yeah, and it's also really interesting because it's like you watch these cameras for so long, and then you think, is this a place that I'll never get to visit? That seems so strange, because it would be almost like you wanting to go to Paris one day or something like that, which would be a normal thing where you're like really invested in like all the things that are Parisian, and like you know what the Eiffel Tower, how it was built, and like you want to go there someday. But then being like, oh wait, you cannot do that. So I think that there's an element of that too, where it's like this really natural, when people get fascinated or interested in a location, naturally we kind of, become interested and want to learn more and then want to be there. And then you kind of have to pull back and be like, no, this isn't, we have to remember that it's a space that, like, for one, it would be dangerous for the guys to have people just show up, because we have had people that is really, really, really rare, but we have had people come in and be like, I'm going to go right to the gate. And it's like, should not have said that, because now we're going to have to alert everybody to it. So like, we don't encourage anybody to do that type of thing, but yeah, I don't know. We do have a lot of people that dream about it, that have felt that they were called to it, that have had strange thing, not just synchronicity, but then have had strange things happen at their houses and stuff. And we talk about the idea of the Hitchhiker Effect, which was completely foreign to me before starting with this group. I think that's where it starts to get really interesting, is when we start to kind of go down that road. Yeah, and the guys will tell you that.
Yeah. And you've got a spreadsheet. One of the things that shocked me about that spreadsheet was people can put in their hitchhiker effects.
Yes,
They're actual
we
experiences, and they're stunning. They're stunning experiences to actually read firsthand from other people.
yeah. I mean, I've had stuff happen at my house. I don't talk about it generally, um, but we've had some really strange things happen, and strange things that you can try as hard as you want to kind of explain away or rationalize away. And I'm open to the idea that it can be literally anything other than. Um, that's one of my interests in being consciousness and psi, and kind of all of this strange stuff. So is it because I'm now thinking more about this stuff, that stuff is happening? Am I impacting my environment? And the ranch really has nothing to do with it, but maybe acted as a catalyst for it. Um, just really strange things. But yeah, we do have that locked where people have to get permission to access it now, just because we have grown to be so big. We want to make sure, again, to go back to people feeling safe to share their things and making sure that it's not just open for everyone to access. I like to keep track of who's accessing it, so that if for whatever reason, if they leave the group, then I know to remove their name. But yeah, it's a lot.
Why are you afraid to talk about the hitchhiker effect that you're experiencing, and yet we're asking people to put it in a spreadsheet, their experiences? You know?
I'm not frightened of it. I'm not frightened of talking about it. It's more of, and I understand what that sounds like. I do. I think the type of person that I am and the type of things that I'm interested in, I don't want to insert or front load people with stuff. My experience has been very different because my involvement has been very different than everyone else, maybe to the extent in which I'm kind of heavily involved behind the scenes. And I've talked about it. I've talked about it I've talked about it at length with people like Eric and Caleb. And then I've talked about it a little bit within the group. I think primarily it's because I don't want to front load people. And honestly, because I'm having a hard time understanding it myself. So I don't know how to properly talk about it. I have written some stuff down in the part of the spreadsheet, and I'm not necessarily against talking about it, as long as I'm like really prefacing it with saying, like, I'm not saying it's one thing or the other. I'm saying I don't understand it. I don't have any frame of understanding any of this. So I think that's part of my hesitation of being like, I don't want people to get in their heads and think like, oh, if I join the Insiders program, then I'm going to start having all this weird stuff happening at my house, because that can be frightening. And it doesn't happen to everybody. But I think I can almost, I do kind of journal it, so I can almost track sort of when things happen. And it does seem to kick up when part of my job kind of in the background has escalated or something like that. So we've had everything from like, and I know people have mentioned to me like, oh, your neighbors might have their remotes, but we don't have that issue here. So our TV turning on and off in the middle of the night, a television that we didn't even think was plugged in. We've had stuff fly off the shelves in our house. We've had light bulbs burst. We've had, oh God, very strange lights that have shown up. We've had a lot of weird things happen. And also, I will say this, that like my family didn't sign up for this. So that's another reason why I'm like, I can talk about it. I don't have any problem talking about it. And then I don't want to discourage other people from talking about it. I just don't want people to think that, because I mean, for all we know, this is happening again because I'm somehow putting that out there into my home because I'm actively researching this stuff, or I'm thinking about it. So yeah, I know that it sounds hypocritical. It's not meant to. It's just I don't know what to make of it, so I don't know how to talk about it really.
Well, of course, this has been a controversial topic because there have been accusations from people I won't name, but people who everybody knows,
Yeah.
that, the Hitchhiker Effect, they've called it a social contagion. And that if this is supposedly so dangerous and we don't know anything about it, should they even be allowing people to participate in the insider program or, watch the TV show about the ranch or whatever? Now, the people who are saying this, I think, are doing it very hypocritically because I don't think they genuinely believe that any of this stuff is real.
Right.
But at the same time, I think it is an important part of the conversation because, people do have these experiences, even not associated with the ranch,
Mhm.
but with the Hitchhiker Effect. Did you ever have any of these experiences before you'd become involved with Skinwalker Ranch?
So, not this stuff specifically, no. What I will say to that though is I think that the conversation definitely needs to be had, not just about the ranch, but I'm one of the things that I think I will probably end up doing as I'm studying, as I'm trying to forge the path in which I want to figure out what I'm doing with studying consciousness and all of that stuff, is try to aid in normalizing the conversation around weird stuff. Because I think that if you were to ask anybody whether or not they know about the ranch or anything, if you were to just go door to door, if there was a way to actually do a proper study and do that, I think the majority of people would say that they've had at least one strange thing happen to them in their life, whether it has to do with the lost loved one or some weird thing that's happened to them. I don't think that it's an abnormal thing. I think that it's a normal thing, and we have just treated it like we can't talk about it. Um, and I also think that the more open we become to things, perhaps we just start noticing stuff more, perhaps more stuff starts happening because we're now sort of interacting on a way that we can't see or in a way we cannot see with the phenomena that's always around us all the time. So perhaps some people are more open to it, and therefore, as they allow themselves the space to start thinking about it in a bigger way, they start having stuff happen. And maybe there's some people that literally I've looked, there was a really interesting study that came out sometime in the last year that was talking about like some differences in brains and how there are people that biologically they literally cannot change their mind about things. Like they're fundamentally biologically unable to sort of look outside of some of these connections where some people are very malleable and able to sort of like, oh, I'm open to the idea of, and their minds can change. So there are individuals that, to no fault of their own, there's no amount of talking that you can do to them to say that this is a possibility, and like, why are you trying to strip it of its validity? And I think the most important thing is like, I think ultimately, I think that people, the debunkers, as it were, get upset because they see money being involved with stuff. So they're easy to be like, oh, this is a grift, right? Like that's the argument. Like this is a grift. This is a grift. Otherwise, why do they care what people's personal experiences are with spirituality or consciousness or how they're operating through life? I think it's something that I always go back to is the fact that I was at a conference not that long ago, and they were talking about grieving spouses. And the conversation was about how a very high percentage of these grieving spouses, I think the study was like 300 people, had some sort of experience after their spouse passed away, where they felt like they saw them or they smelled them or they felt them or they dreamt of them and they thought it was really them. And what I took away from that is the fact that there's another stage of grief that we don't talk about, right? Human beings need to feel like we're connected to something else. And there has to be space for that conversation. We have to make space for the conversation of saying, if you go see a therapist or something like that, and you say, oh, I saw my dead husband, it doesn't become, and granted, there are specific cases where like, oh, we want to make sure that they're okay. But if it's comforting to them, then you're working through something that to me seems like a very natural human experience as we're trying to process all of these weird things that are happening around us and then being convinced that we're not supposed to talk about it. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So if debunkers want to be upset about money being spent, then as long as it's not their money being spent, I don't know why they should be concerned. Otherwise, I think trying to take away anyone's ability to understand the world around them, no matter what lens that's through, doesn't need to be like, there's no real purpose to it. That's literally a job trying to strip someone of them making sense of what the meaning of life is and how they fit into it and how they interact with it. Whether or not that manifests in weird bulbs bursting or the television turning on and off or whatever, it doesn't really matter because that's my own personal experience to me. Like, is it a social contagion? Well, if it is, then that's really interesting. Why are we trying to sweep that under the rug and treat it like it's a bad thing? How interesting is it that we can now say, like, what makes this a social contagion? Why do people grasp onto that? Isn't that conversation important? Sorry. I'm very like passionate about it though, because I have a big problem. I have a big problem with trying to take people's ability to understand life and loss and the unknown away from them. It seems very natural. I mean, we've been doing it forever. People have been looking up to the sky and praying to gods and things for a very long time.
And it's interesting that we don't do it with any, like if somebody says they're depressed, nobody comes up to them and says, no, you're not. Like,
right.
Prove it. You're not having an emotion. You're not having an experience.
Right.
They don't question that until it's something that they don't understand, something they haven't experienced. And that seems to generally be the dividing line is the people who have had an experience say, I know what it was. Like it was not anything explainable, nothing prosaic. The people who haven't had that experience go, it had to be prosaic because that's all there is. There isn't something more than that. And that's the conversation that, we need to have. Our society needs to have this conversation about, we don't understand everything. We don't have it all figured out. And these experiences for many people are spiritually transformative experiences. They fundamentally change a person's life and the way they engage with the world around them.
Yeah.
And it's something that other people go, well, it just didn't happen to you. It's like, well, if it didn't happen to them, why did it have such a profound effect? And why are we trying to tell them that it didn't happen to them if it is having this generally positive effect on people? The short term, the effect can be much more negative and dramatic. Like people will often, like if somebody's had an NDE and they come back, they'll go through a divorce, they'll lose friends over it, things like that. But then ultimately it's a very positive experience. And I know you know all this because of your studies into consciousness and psychology and everything.
I've also had an NDE. Like I think I'm personally invested in a conversation. And I think that again is where some frustration comes from, is the fact that like for anybody to process any type of trauma or a huge event, they have to be given safe space to process it, no matter what that looks like. I wish there was a way to, perhaps in some far off time in the future, my goal would be to try to develop some sort of scale that we could really, I don't know, find a way to measure whether or not somebody, because this is where my fear comes in, whether or not someone may be having a psychiatric event that needs to be addressed and not be confused with things. And I think that is a very blurry line and a very important line to not ignore as being part of the conversation too. Because when people are having true psychiatric events and they are having true hallucinations, then we can't just pretend that it's something like what we're talking about. So I think that that's my one concern outside of being able to just talk about this in a normal way. Because for me, my interest totally changed. And this is what I'm studying now. And I think that that's a benefit. I also think that it gave me more, more confidence in being like, we should be talking about this stuff. I I think I also started looking at the world through a different lens of being like a little confused as to why it's fine for us to dive into religions and things, but it's not okay to also talk about what that actually means. Like their spirituality and religion can be together, they can be separate. I mean, it's still at the end of the day this drive within a human being to connect to something greater than themselves. And depending on what you want to call it or what umbrella you want to put it under is fine. I don't think we should be going and kicking sand at people under their umbrellas, though, because all of our experiences are so different. And I think it's wrong to try to strip somebody else's experiences away from them. And there might be a totally normal way to explain this stuff. Eventually, maybe we'll have the science to say, like, oh, you are interacting with something and this is why it occurred. But that's still something that you're interacting with kind of as the catalyst. Or is it something like, I'm not saying that the science won't eventually get there, but I think we've been behind. Human beings have been behind science for a really long time. We've always asked bigger questions. That's how we've gotten to where we are. I mean, I think about all the time how, 150 years ago, we were in like just starting out with, I don't know how long ago I was with like the airplane, and now we've got a drone on Mars. So, I mean, we're moving exponentially into the future, exponentially. So I kind of wish that people would just be like, why don't you just wait for the science to catch up? Because I don't think it's going to be that much longer.
But it has to be willing to look at it. And right now it isn't. Like people are saying,
I know,
with Grush and the whistleblower, they're saying we shouldn't be investigating it. Like they're already making the determination it's got to be wrong and that we shouldn't be wasting any time or resources on looking into it. And not just, UAP. This applies to NDEs, for example, because they say, well, those have already been explained.
But they haven't been. I mean, they have, but they haven't been. I mean, there's great departments that you never even know about. The University of Virginia, which is where I'm at, has the Department of Perceptual Studies. That is a literal department within the University of Virginia that studies reincarnation and near-death experiences. It's Jim Tucker and Bruce Grayson who developed the Grayson scale. Like we've got some pretty remarkable minds at work just quietly because nobody wants to fund it. Which again is just crazy to me, and also makes, I mean, personally, that it does make it a scary career path to try to take. I always joke about, like, I'm just going to be a very broke research scientist because I don't know who's going to pay me to look at this stuff, but I'm still going to do it. I have also found that people tend to be in Europe. There's a lot more conversations around this stuff than in America. They have a lot more opportunity. Like it's not an unusual thing to talk about. I wanna give a hard, fast answer being when you're saying that people are like, oh, we shouldn't pour money into it, that it can be a one size fits all, or those people are just frightened or whatever. But I don't think that it's always that. And I think that what's important is to try to find a place where we're starting to meet in the middle here. Like I'm a believer, but I'm still going to ask questions. And you can do that too. People can, in fact, be believers and use discernment. It's not like all of us are all in all of the time. The questions are what help move the needle. So to say that, oh, let's just throw it to the wayside, that's really kind of a travesty, in my opinion. I mean, and not just to society as a whole, but to ourselves personally. I don't think I'd ever want to be the type of person that would be so willing to decide, oh, this is all fake, unless I've got some sort of, unless I'm given the privilege of seeing something. Because then you're still going to have people that might see something up close and still don't believe it. And perhaps they're not meant to. Part of one of the things that I'm curious about is whether or not evolutionarily we need to catch up with it too, because perhaps some people's brains are just not there yet. Not to say that it's not to say that they're not like the fantastic minds, but I almost feel like we need to all kind of as a species agree that this is a benefit to us to move us forward as a species, whatever that takes to get us there. I'm not sure. I don't feel comfortable in trying to push somebody, just like I wouldn't want somebody to push me either. I think that there needs to be space for people to explore, but if they're not willing to, then there's nothing we're gonna be able to do about it. I don't think. I mean, do you? Do you think if we try to force people into?
No, I don't think you can. Many are called and few are chosen. I mean, and there's got to be opposition here. There's always going to be skeptics. There's got to be pushback. That's how we get progress. We don't want everyone drinking the Kool-Aid. I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid yet. I've had experiences, but I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid. You've got to have that BS detector at all times. But it can go too far. There's these pseudo skeptics that actually they sort of ignore their own experiences. Some of these guys have seen craft. They've got YouTube videos where they're talking about the craft they've seen, and now they're saying it's all just weather balloons and flares. So there's a psychological component here, clearly.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing they say is this is all about the money. So can you tell us a little bit about how does the money flow? So you've got all these people paying this money. Where does the money go? What's it going to go towards? Can you kind of explain it? Because you're not getting paid. You're doing this for a volunteer, right?
Yes, I'm getting. I'm
Brandon,
getting paid in experience and in conversation, and to me, that's enough. The community that I've built has been payment enough, I think. Yeah.
Brandon just said that he basically wanted to make sure that it was standalone. It funded itself. That the group wasn't a sinkhole. That it actually funded itself, and then on top of that, the money would be used to even make it better and invest. And he's done that. There's more cameras, there's more infrastructure in place. Yes. So can you just tell us a little bit about that? The money.
I am not privy to exactly everything, but I do know this. I will tell you what I know, which is exactly what you just said, that it is standalone. So, we have a great company that runs the program. But it's small. There's only 3 guys, and they do the website and they manage member issues, and they're making sure that everything is working and making sure that they're available and having Zoom meetings with moderators and answering emails while they're trying, like most jobs you have from 8 to 5 or whatever. Like I sometimes will have to email them at 11 o'clock at night and they get right back to me. So part of the funding I know goes to that because it's a totally separate entity. So the insiders fund that. But we're getting it back in a tenfold, right? Like they're constantly, when we've been like, oh, all we have is this YouTube channel. People have said that, which I was great with just the YouTube channel, but then they gave us a Discord server and then they made sure that Facebook was set up. I mean, we're right at the beginning of the program and it's been kind of amazing how much they've been able to give back to people. Or like Phenomicon that's coming up, there's going to be a private event that's just for insiders to be able to do like a meet and greet with the team. If you're an insider, which is really, really cool. And then I know that a portion of it goes back to the ranch and some of the preservation. I know like the shop, I think it's like 100% of anything in the shop goes right back to the homesteads to preserve them, to take care of them. And from what I understand, the rest of that money is also going right back into research on the ranch. That is my full understanding. And that's all I've ever witnessed. As it being the more we've grown, the more we've gotten. So it tends to be evident through that as well. I'm also, and I didn't say this before when we were talking about the benefits of it. It's also shocking to me that the guys make time every single week, especially right now when they're working these really long days. We do a ranch revelations on Thursday nights where after the show is aired on Tuesday, these guys who've been working, the team who's been working all day long, comes into this room and you can tell that they're tired and sweaty and they still talk to us for like 2-3 hours sometimes and answer questions and things. So that's another thing where we're talking about making sure that people are, because the team that runs the program, that's at night. Sometimes it's at 10:30 at night. I know they're on the East Coast. So it's going towards making sure that the people that are running the program are getting paid and then giving back to the ranch and doing research and all of that stuff. That's all I know. I wish that I had more information, but yeah, to me, I'm also part of a couple of other like little, I wouldn't call them little, but other, now I'm part of like another group that's online, not involved the way that I am with the ranch. And it's way more expensive. And I feel like it's a steal to me, at least, because we're still paying, I think the memberships are still paying the same amount that we were from day one when we only just had a camera. Like we had the camera view and they had the YouTube, and now we've got like this huge expansive program. So I don't know I don't know what they made to host a Discord server the way that we've got it. I don't know what the back end of any of that stuff is, but I do feel confident in saying that if the majority, if not all of the funding is going right back into the program and to the ranch preservation stuff and the research there.
Right. It's not exactly a cash cow.
No.
Yeah.
It's $10 a month. And again, I don't want to belittle people in knowing that that can be a struggle for some individuals. Like sometimes that's a lot of money. It can be a lot of money. But when you're talking about like what the program is and treating it like they're like making hordes of cash off of people, like it's $10 a month. I think my Starbucks earlier cost that much, which is horrible to say, but it's true. So again, yeah, they're not making, it's not like they've got, they're raking in cash on this.
Yeah.
Which I think is the intention too. We've tried to actually, to that point, we've told Brandon that we've wanted to like raise money for something specific to give to the program. And he's like, no, we don't want people to do fundraising. That by itself is, I think, is good evidence to the fact that like, if they really were just trying to take people's money, I don't know, it seems that you would jump at the chance for people to start raising money to help you buy equipment. And he's like, no, the Insiders program it'll pay back to itself and that's it. So I might have gone on too long with that answer, but
no, we got plenty of time.
Going back to the whole accusation of grifting, and Brandon has made it clear over and over and over again that he is not profiting off the History Channel show. Yeah. And people still insist on calling him a grifter. Like they'll say he must be lying, because if they can't call him a grifter, then they don't have anything else to accuse him of.
What does Brandon need to grift for, though? Like he's a successful business. Like what purpose would that serve? Of all things, if anything, being involved with the ranch and all of this public facing stuff in this domain, you would think would hurt. Like he's taking a huge risk with his career. It's not like somebody looks to their person that's doing such a huge amount of real estate business in the state of Utah to be like, yes, I also want you to be involved in this weird alien ranch show. Like it's not like necessarily a benefit to him. He has zero reason to grift. Like he's a successful businessman in his own right. He also doesn't, Brandon puts up with a lot. He is much more patient than I think a lot of people in his position would be. He is consistently like gives people the benefit of the doubt and welcomes them in, and it's like, I'm trying to be as transparent as possible. And sometimes we're all like, no, don't do that. Like these people aren't nice. Like it's not going to end well. But he still does it because he's so dedicated to the truth of the situation, which is that he's being transparent, and he's doing this because he's interested in it. Now, I've joked about the fact that I've asked whether or not he bought the ranch because he was interested in like horror films or because he was interested in real estate. And I think that it's right in the middle. I think that he has a natural inclination to be interested in like, I don't know, you guys have seen his collection of things. Like he's interested in this stuff. And it also happens to be, something that he was able to purchase. Not everybody who's interested in these things can purchase this stuff. But the idea that Brandon could be grifting is just wild to me. Like the man doesn't need to. He has, for what? Like it just doesn't make any sense. I don't know.
So why do you think he bought the ranch?
I think to go back to saying that, I mean, I jokingly say the thing about the horror stuff because we know he's got an interest in like sci-fi stuff. I think that he is genuinely interested and the same thing that we all are, which is what else could be out there? I think I think I heard that he read maybe a book and then was somebody, I don't know the chain of events, so I don't want to speak to it, but I think that he's interested in all this stuff just as much as we are. The only difference is like I don't have the money to buy a spooky ranch. If I did, I would. I mean, I definitely would. If I had the finances to buy a spooky ranch and put some physicists on it and a research team together, I would absolutely do it. I feel like a lot of people would if they were interested in this stuff and were given the opportunity. Difference is that Brandon is interested in this stuff, given the opportunity, and then was able to do it. So I think he's genuinely interested. I don't know what his motivations behind this interest are. We all have our own reasons, but I certainly don't think it was like he looked at this ranch and thought, how can I monetize it? I don't believe that.
Do you believe that we're dealing with a non-human intelligence on the ranch?
Yes.
Okay. So
I don't know what I think that looks like, but
is it aware of us? Is it at least aware of who's on the ranch and what they're thinking?
I think so.
Okay.
I
So
think that yeah.
okay, so did Brandon get the ranch or did the ranch get Brandon?
That's a great question.
You know where I'm going with that?
I think that's a great question. And the stories that I've heard about kind of everybody and how they've ended up there, I think that's a good question for the whole team. And I think that question can even extend to other people that get involved. So it goes back to, we're just circling back around to the conversation of being called to, which sounds, I don't even know what that would actually look like. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That gets into territory where I don't have any solid answers. I don't have my mind made up about some of that stuff. I also think that there's a lot of moving parts to what's going on at the ranch. I'm not sure it's all one thing. I think there might be several elements that have created the perfect storm. So
Jacques Vallée talks about the phenomenon as being a control system.
right.
That it's getting people to behave in certain ways to accomplish whatever it's trying to accomplish. But yeah, it sounds like you're thinking that maybe people end up at the ranch because, I mean, there's such a wide variety of people there right now with some amazing backgrounds. They all bring something to it. But what a weird, diverse group to end up, as you put it, on a spooky ranch.
Yeah.
And I also think it's amazing that Brandon has made this available to the public, because as we're starting to see through beyond Skinwalker Ranch, Skinwalker Ranch is not a unique location.
Right.
There are other places that are like this. And that's surprising news because you don't hear about them. Occasionally somebody will be like, I grew up in a haunted house. And you can pay to go ghost hunt at, places. But nobody is making these places just publicly available. Like if you want to go ghost hunt in a famous place, you pay money to do that, Brandon, meanwhile, was like, I want the public to know about this, and I want to try and figure it out at the same time.
Yeah.
And he's making that available, and I think that's amazing.
I agree with you. And I think that one of the things that I would hear a lot sort of at the beginning is people coming in and they would say, like, the ranch isn't the only place that's like this. And I, of course, having read a bunch of different things, I'm like, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't assume it is. I think it's a testament to the pursuit of discovery when someone is comfortable enough to say, let's go beyond. Let's literally go beyond the ranch and like start looking at the bigger picture. But we've heard this. I've heard this from Eric about how like there's a full acknowledgement on their end that they didn't think that the ranch was, I mean, granted, there's a lot of, it's a great place to be confined that you can set up shop and do research on. But there are a lot of other places. And I think starting to have the conversation again more publicly and allowing people to become part of the conversation and the narrative is another way of showing that like this doesn't just belong to us, it belongs to everybody. And like we want to open up the conversation for people to be talking about it. So, and I think it's interesting because television has a way of doing that where maybe because people are watching a show, they're going to feel more comfortable talking about an episode that they've watched because it's local to them or because they were familiar slightly with it. And then that conversation kind of, it blossoms into more stuff where people will feel more comfortable talking about their own experiences or what have you. So I think it's all part of moving things forward. It'll be really interesting to see all of the places that they end up going. If they return to places to continuously check for data points, if anything changes with this new, you know, all this congressional stuff and I think the Schumer, didn't it get passed this week? Didn't they end up passing it?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's an interesting, because there's that eminent domain part that's in that bill where if stuff is discovered, what happens with it. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how things play out.
One of the more interesting parts, and I don't know if it made it into the final bill, but I thought was the most interesting was where it was basically saying the Biden administration needs to put together a panel of people for disclosure, which included like a sociologist and a scientist and a historian, and it was a group of 9 people. And the fact that there's legislation that was passed to basically say the president needs to inform the public that UFOs are real, and you know, how are they putting it? Well, we'll just say non-human intelligence is here, and that we have evidence of it, is astounding. And clearly, the public is going to be dragged, kind of kicking and screaming along on that because they've been lied to for so long and ridiculed, and people are scared to even, I think, publicly think about it, like to be willing to publicly think about it and acknowledge to other people, you know, is it okay for me to talk about this or think about it?
For sure. I mean, I find that I often wonder if I'm part of the problem because I'm so reserved in my conversation about these things. Like that's a thing that I deal with constantly within myself. Am I part of the problem of not normalizing the conversation because I still have these reservations about sharing stuff? And what does that say about me? And if it says it about me, what does that say about people who aren't heavily involved in this stuff? Right? Like I'm heavily involved in this stuff and I'm still very reserved in my conversation. And I do very much, again, go back to being like, well, I don't understand it. So I'm definitely one of those people that like, I don't ever want to make my comments be 100% of anything because I'm still understanding them myself. But I do wonder if, you know, why I'm not talking about it more. Because I can imagine it. I can imagine being at, or even last night, somebody asking me what I've been up to, like a mother of my children's friends. And it's like, what do I say here? Like, what have I really been up to? Or like, what is comfortable for you in this situation? Because it's a much bigger, you know, like it's not something that you can just be like, oh, I I watch the congressional hearings. I'm doing all this work with the ranch because then it's just like people don't know how to respond to that. I don't know how to even to broach that with people. I do think it's interesting though because we do need a team of people like that, sociologists, historians, psychologists. Like it isn't just scientists like physicists and things. And I think that's another part of like normalizing the conversation is bringing in people with a bunch of different backgrounds. um, but I've also heard and seen that, I mean, it's become a joke online about how people are just like really tired of everything happening all the time, that they're just over it. They're just like, okay, I don't really care. Like, fine, aliens are here, whatever. Like it doesn't matter. Um, I also, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the fact that, like, yeah, people lie and people tell the truth. And the government has told us lies. And maybe the government is telling us the truth now. It's made a mess for all of us, though. Like, there's no way of getting through this and not acknowledging the fact that, like, this has been a messy journey, and all of us, like, we should be asking questions with um, a willingness to make, I think, as educated opinions as we possibly can on stuff, because to deny the fact that we haven't been lied to in the past, that the secrecy of it hasn't been weaponized in some way, that there could be, I mean, I think to acknowledge the fact that, like, the government could have lied about UFOs, and UFOs could, like, and the government also could have used that lie to develop our own high-tech stuff, and UFOs can also exist, can literally all be on the same thing. Like, we can acknowledge that even though the government has a history of lying about stuff to cover up our own tech, doesn't mean that there isn't also UFOs. Because I think that's another thing that I have seen is people being like, well, Richard Doty and misinformation campaigns, and this is just a distraction. And, like, yeah, that could be the case, but there could also still be, like, it's not an either or, it can be both. And I think that that's the most frustrating thing. It's like there's some people that aren't like hardcore debunkers, but they are very much like, we've been lied to. Like, we know that people have made stuff up in the past to misinform the public. Is that what's happening again? Is Grush another Doty? Is what I've seen. And that's a whole different conversation. So I don't know.
The response I have to that generally is, it's not just the government saying this. It's countless people all over the world who are saying the same thing. And it's like, even if the government is lying, the chances that all of those people are lying when they have nothing to gain from it and a lot to lose.
Yeah.
That's where I say, look, this is why this needs to be taken seriously. And, I don't doubt that people in the government are going to try and take advantage of it, because that's what people do. But that doesn't mean that there's not something to it. But yeah, we do need to ask a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think it's funny, the idea of disclosure, because I know that, I mean, I feel like I've gotten a really immersive education in some of this stuff, because I didn't come in to the ranch or any of that stuff with like a historical background in UFO or any of these things. Like, that's not what brought me there. So I have found that there's a very weird circle of like consciousness, remote viewing, or like it like everything is connected, is what it seems. So I went the other way around, where I feel like the community that I've walked into mostly has gone this way. So they've gone UFOs and then backward to consciousness, where I've kind of gone this way. So I've had to learn a lot. And the more I learn, the less I know, which I can say very confidently. And I think the idea of like disclosure with a capital D is a really interesting concept to me, because disclosure kind of hinges solely upon the government, opposed to acknowledgement of individuals' personal experiences. So like disclosure, I guess disclosure is only contingent upon whether or not the government acknowledges it versus us just deciding that, like, even though we're not in the government, we've had our own personal experiences, and I can say that this is real. And there's a whole bunch of us. There's throughout history, there's a whole bunch of us. Like that isn't enough for people to take it seriously, which is very interesting. I mean, when you look at the psychology of that, it's very interesting that people have to have it come from our leadership, right? Just like as social creatures, the fact that like we're unwilling to listen to our social equals, but instead have to hear it from our leader, is a little, I mean, it's a little weird to think about. Like, why is it that we feel like that's necessary?
Yeah, some
I don't
people,
know.
they're not going to believe it until the president says it, right? Or till the Pentagon comes out and says it. What do you think about the phenomenon itself, bringing out the big D disclosure itself? And if it can do synchronicities on Skinwalker Ranch, can it do synchronicities in Washington, D.C.? Can it, you know,
Oh yeah.
isn't this non-human intelligence a factor across the board?
I mean, I think
Is it
so.
playing a role in disclosure? And what is that role?
Well, that's a big question to ask. Yeah, I mean, I would think so. The more thought I've put into this over the last year, and I know that this is a conversation that a lot of people have had for a really long time, so this isn't new. But I do think it's really, for me, I think looking at our art in terms of movies and stories, and how a lot of these things have predated some of the stuff that we're now seeing. You know, I've actually seen recently a lot of people referencing like the flight of the navigator and orbs, for example, and how we're kind of like hedged. Or, you know, you go back to some of these films from a really long time ago or stories from a really long time ago. And so I've certainly thought about the fact that like, is our subconscious tapping into something maybe more that's helping us move it into our conscious minds through our storytelling? And is that designed on purpose? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but these are questions that I'm asking because some of these things are wild in their coincidences. I mean, we think about it in the sense of like, we know that some science that has come forward was literally born from people that are now physicists watching Star Trek as kids. Like, to think of that is insane. Like, they saw this stuff and were like, I actually want to make this happen. And then they did. So the fact that the story of it, the idea of these specific things were just sitting in somebody's mind, and not only did they put it out there, but then it was very much consumed by popular culture, is really interesting because then it happened. So, I mean, I know that they've talked about how like, oh, it's being dosed through Hollywood. I think I've heard somebody say that before, like, oh, they're dosing us with this stuff. Maybe, I don't know. I think the question is, to what end? Like, if this is being directed by some sort of phenomena, to what end? And is it inescapable because now we do have technology? I think that's, if anything, has put sort of like a burning fire behind stuff. It's because we are exponentially moving forward with technology. Our technological advancement at this time in human history is just mind blowing. So is it inevitable, and therefore it has to move forward in that direction? Was it always going to? These are very big questions I don't have answers to. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there are many famous artists, writers who say that they believe that the ideas that, or scientists, as a matter of fact, who said that the ideas that they felt were being communicated to them by an external force. I think we've talked about this even on this show before. It comes up a lot. Nikola Tesla was a good example of that. And, you know, Dean, what you're talking about with the the phenomenon at the ranch, communicating to people, manipulating people, giving messages to people. Can you maybe, Shannon, talk about some of the personal education that you've been doing in terms of parapsychology and how that's informed your opinions on what you're seeing at the ranch?
I can. So my interest in all of it, parapsychology, consciousness, everything, I think came from my NDE, and it came through experiencing a lot of loss growing up. I had a lot of loss that surrounded me a lot through death, and then I also was in very religious schools. So I think those setting the foundation is important to recognize, and sort of my approach in terms of as a child, you're exposed to it being, you're literally taught that there's something outside of yourself. Like there's God, right? Like God created everything. So you're just like, that's in you. And then trying to make sense of what that even looks like as you lose people. And then you have your own stuff happen. So I started wanting to look at why it was specific people that, have these out-of-body experiences, these not near-death experiences necessarily, because that can literally happen to any one of us, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we all can have a near-death experience. There's not really something that needs to happen beforehand. Or have these gifts, which I'm a big Tyler Henry fan. I think he is an extraordinary talent. I also find it very interesting that he's had so many health issues, with his brain and all of that stuff. And so that is kind of where I start researching, right? Like I start looking at kind of, you look at this whole scale of things where there's people that are maybe intuitive psychics, and there are people who have these out-of-body experiences, and there's people that can do remote viewing, or you even some of these parasite conferences that I've gone to, you watch really interesting stuff about people being able to literally light candles, or apportations of the gold leaf lady and all of this stuff. And so I start wondering what it is about a person physically first, and then how maybe experiences combine with that. So when I take that to the ranch, when I start thinking about the ranch, I think the case that was most interesting to me, that drew me in, was Thomas. So obviously it's health related stuff, and I feel uncomfortable to a degree talking about his own stuff because I'm not him. But what we all know is, he's got this brain swelling that happens, or, his having the swelling. And what I would like to see happen, what I would like to do, and I'm not sure, again, it gets very complicated because of it being private medical stuff. For the whole team, what I would love to see happen is be able to sort of look into the past to see specific things that have happened in their lives, look at their medical history leading up to, because it doesn't make sense to me why two individuals can be standing right next to each other and have something happen. Granted, there is a whole group of people that are like, oh, this is a targeted, almost like Havana syndrome, like this is a targeted thing that's happened to him. But then you've also got individuals who have cardiac events, standing next to somebody that it's not happening to, or you have people that have visions of things that can be standing next to somebody and it's not happening to. So what is it is it a biological component to it, or is it something that has to do with their conscious mind or their subconscious mind? And that's where I would take sort of the parapsych approach to it, which is sort of looking at that person's experiences growing up, maybe, or their exposure. One of the things that I'm most interested in, especially throughout studying, and the more I study it, the more confident I feel that there might be a component in it, is trauma in childhood or adolescence, and like a predisposition to having perhaps a more openness to some of this stuff, which is a very odd thing to say, but it almost takes me back to like when individuals, especially in childhood or adolescence, have a traumatic event, then they tend to dissociate. Like that becomes a component in maybe like panic or anxiety attacks. And dissociation is very similar, albeit less comfortable than the idea of meditation. And so when we start looking at people that meditate and have these experiences, it does take me back to like this dissociative property involved, and maybe how, like, hypothetically, you know, as whatever, you leave a door open because you've got to survive in this world, but maybe you have to be detached from this world as well. And so is that door sort of ajar as you grow up into your adulthood? And does that make you more vulnerable to things? I don't know. This is all the stuff I don't know, but I'm interested in finding out. And I think the ranch is a good example because you've got one space that's like a living laboratory, and you have people there and they are having such vastly different experiences medically. Or, you know, I think Bryant Dragon jokes about how he's like a deterrent for this stuff. Like nothing will happen when he's around. And that's really interesting.
He's a
It
goat.
really is. Yeah. Why though?
Sheep goat. Yeah.
For what reason?
You know, I think that's a really interesting point that you've brought up, because here is this group at the ranch that is putting a tremendous amount of time into studying the phenomenon of the ranch, but we don't seem to have any awareness that they're studying themselves.
Yeah,
and
that's what I want to do.
Yeah, and they're obviously contributing to what is happening at the ranch and in various ways. So yeah, I'd be curious if they're doing anything and we're just not hearing about it. Or
I think they keep track of some things. Like in our Discord, we have Caleb and Eric both have journals where they, because this is a conversation that we, not just myself, but a lot of other members had, which is like, we want to know, you should be journaling this stuff. And so they have started to journal some when they've had specific things happen. But yeah, I mean, I think if you look at people as being this very complex biosensor, I know that they are doing some stuff, but I would really like to see a more expansive study done. And that's a very hard thing to orchestrate. I mean, I think that's what makes the field of parapsychology very difficult, because when you're talking about statistical samples, right, like it is next to impossible to get a good, like Dean Radin just had a study that was an extraordinary study, and it was like over 18 years and like 250,000 participants. And that is a big enough study. And like the way that it was done, he was able to cut out all the bias. But like when you're talking about statistics, like that's the degree in which you have to conduct something with human beings to be able to say with any type of statistical significance that you can draw any type of conclusion from. So I think it becomes complicated when you talk about a small team on a ranch. But even though it's complicated and it doesn't have to necessarily be hard science, I think that the data collection is important. If they are doing that, they certainly haven't brought it to the forefront of anything. Again, I think that it's complicated with like HIPAA and there being medical stuff. And also when it comes down to it, you're talking about like, is there a component psychologically of some of these things? And if there is other stories behind it, then that becomes very sensitive information that people might not want to share. So, but I'm not sure how much I contribute outside of that though. Outside of the spreadsheet, because I'm not a physicist. I'm interested in it. I've learned a lot. But but I'm definitely here for that part of it. And I think it's an important part of it, especially when we're having the conversation around like, is this consciousness, is this happening on a level of consciousness? Is the ranch actually an intelligent thing that's causing things to happen? Is the if the hitchhiker effect is real, like what highway is that traveling on? I think it's real because I obviously experienced stuff and I've heard stories and I've witnessed things. But like, what is that path? What does that highway look like? How is that highway? Like, does it have to find a crack to navigate through in individuals? I don't know. Do you know?
Yeah, I do. I have all the answers. No.
Do you?
No,
Share them
I don't.
with me, please.
I don't. I think a big part of the problem is the way we actually talk about this and the way we see it, the way we perceive it. For example, we talk about the ranch. Is the ranch intelligent? It's not. It's just dirt and rocks, and it's a physical place. It's not the physical place. It's not really about the land, literally the land. We're talking about a non-human intelligence.
Right.
And so there's a place, set and setting basically. And then there's this non-human intelligence. And is it precognitive? People say it's precognitive. People say it can read your mind. So it can read your thoughts and it can see your future. That's
or it makes you do things. I mean, it's either, right? Like, is it seeing your future or is it causing the future to happen? I mean,
exactly.
I think that's interesting. To go back to the Dean Radin thing, him talking about like our future brain and our past brain being connected on some quantum level. And so that's a wild thing to think about. And his study that he did, which was most interesting and I think applicable to the ranch, is that he has found that novelty is what is the biggest predictor for these sort of psi events, not probability. And when we talk about the stuff on the ranch, they've often said that when new things are introduced, whenever we do something new, when we bring someone new there, stuff seems to happen. And that's without ever knowing that it's the newness of something, this novelty of something that could act as more of a catalyst than, the probability of something happening. Because you're right. The ranch is, and it's not confined to just that odd shape of land that they've got. It's like 2 squares. It extends past everything. I mean, from what we know too, like the surrounding areas, but is it precognitive or is it us being driven by it? I don't know.
Well, let me give you one example. And I think this is the most telling thing about what's really going on the ranch. I think this is the core story. And that's Lekatsky, right? He goes with Bigelow on the ranch. They go in the main homestead and they're in the kitchen. They're not in the living room. They're in the kitchen, right? And he sees that pipe shape that materialize. He does not recognize what it is, but he sees this chrome pipe thing and he sees it. The other 2 people don't. It comes and goes in a mist. I think it was yellow. There's some colors involved. It was solid. Right. He's only been on the ranch for, like I said, 20, 30 minutes. He's stunned. He's so scared. He doesn't even say anything. He gets in the car and they leave the ranch. And once they get far enough from the ranch, he goes, "Hey, I actually saw something back there." Right. It was a personal thing to him. He didn't really know what the meaning of the symbol was. Right. But it was such a profound experience. Lekatsky ends up being the guy that goes back to Pentagon and says, he was the one that really pushed for the military getting involved, Pentagon getting involved. There wouldn't have been an OSAP without that one vision, right? And we might not even have the disclosure hearings this week if we hadn't had that. And even the debunkers have acknowledged that one narrative, that one experience that Lekatsky had on Skinwalker Ranch basically did everything. The whole disclosure sort of started there because of him and OSAP, which led to ATIP, Lou Elizondo. So I wonder in that moment, and what's really interesting about that is it come to find out that tubular shape that he saw, it's actually the album cover to Mike Oldfield's album, Tubular Bells.
I have heard that. Yeah. Yes.
But also that song, it's a theme song for a movie.
Which movie is it?
The Exorcist. It's the actual, it's the main theme song to the Exorcist movie. Okay. So you step back from that and say, okay, we're dealing with the non-human intelligence. I can't believe that came from Lakatsky. And so I'm wondering, okay, does it know that it's going to have this little effect, this butterfly effect into the future? Or, the non-human intelligence, I'm convinced the non-human intelligence is a part of this puzzle. It's a separate intelligent entity that we're dealing with that we quite often forget about. But does it know what's going on? Is it among us? Well, a lot of people are feeling like they're getting communication from the phenomenon, whatever the phenomenon is. People feel they're getting communication. So in that sense, it is among us because a lot of people are actually feeling like they're in communication with it. They have a relationship with it, right? The other thing is you mentioned Star Trek. A lot of people have heard of Star Trek, right? Most people have heard of Star Wars. But everybody on this planet has either seen a UFO or seen one in the theater, seen it on television. Everybody knows what the word alien means. And so it's in our collective unconscious. Everybody knows what a UFO is. We're debating not whether they're real or not, but we know what a UFO actually is. And so we're sort of set up with all of this collective unconscious priming, if you will. And then these little events happen on the ranch that have huge implications. And I don't feel like we're done with that. I feel like there's something else is going to happen on the ranch, maybe even a small thing that is going to have huge consequences.
Oh, I think so too. I fully think so. I'm interested to see how it plays out in the public sphere. I have very complicated feelings on that because I feel like it's exciting and scary, if that makes sense. It's exciting, whatever discovery I firmly believe is coming. And also scary because we know how people react to stuff and they forget that they're actual just people. They might be on television and you might know their name, but they're people that are working on the ranch and their safety is really important. And also, you don't know, just in general, like the ranch itself is a pretty hostile environment in terms of geography and bugs and heat and all of that stuff. But then you throw in this other element, that's where it becomes scary, not for anything outside of that. It's like I often worry about the team themselves and making sure that people don't get overzealous. So I'm interested to see how it's going to play out. But I very, very much agree with you. I've heard this repeatedly, is that Skinwalker Ranch is kind of at the center of moving all of this forward because of it going to the government, and then these people that have been involved with it all have ties to the ranch. I mean, I haven't seen one name really that's come up recently that doesn't have some sort of if the person who hired them has a connection to the ranch. I mean, Dave Fravor was naming people during the congressional hearing, so we all know are connected to the ranch. Brandon has publicly said that he's gone and sat in front of Congress before. Like, that's not a private thing. Like, we know this for a fact. The tubular bell thing is really interesting because you also have to think of like the point A to point B in Lakatsky's head to be comfortable enough to share that. Like, I'd like to have known what went through his mind that made him decide that he was going to say something and not just keep it to himself. Because being in his position, he would have had a lot more to lose and to gain from something like that. And if it had been something else that had been shown to him too, would it have had a different impact? So it seems really interesting that it was so specific. And I do think that we see a lot of that. I think that these synchronicities and these visions or sounds of like disembodied voices and things, the communication that's occurring, that is a theme that runs through it. And I think that it reminds us that the ranch isn't just a location. And perhaps that's how Hitchhiker Effect operates, is because we see everything as very like the point A to point B, like here to there, but really kind of everything operates together. And so there is not much of a separation, even though there is a physical location that is the ranch, that the whatever's operating there isn't bound by any type of geographical location, perhaps.
Well, I think the details of that event say a lot about the phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Because he saw that specific shape. Now, the phenomenon theoretically could have made him see literally anything. It could have given him a direct message of, you are not alone, or shown him a UFO or a floating alien head or whatever it wanted to say, something more direct. But instead, it showed him a shape that he didn't even know what the meaning of it was at the time.
Mm-hmm.
He found it out later. And it had a sense of humor to it.
It does.
I mean,
it seems like it does.
The Exorcist theme.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are the odds that that's a coincidence? It seems pretty low.
Mm-hmm.
So why did it choose to do that specifically? Why did it work in that way? And I think what we can do is we can correlate that to other people's experiences,
Mm-hmm.
because they tend to have the same type of thing where it's something abstract that has a deeper meaning, but they have to figure it out. They've got to dig down into it to try and understand it.
Yeah.
It's kind of the idea that the phenomenon is kind of poking us and going, you need to look deeper. You need to look within yourself. You need to explore this and figure out what it means.
Well, I mean, I think you can apply that same type of logic to anything else. And I mean, to go back to basics, when you say like, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day, teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. It's the same kind of principle. Like if you were to just make it that plain, then there's not much necessity for you to spend time with it and to really think about it and to learn about it and to make it personal to you. I mean, I think the fact that our emotions as a human being and even how we interpret messages tend to be pretty complex, it almost necessitates that type of messaging to come back to us if we want it to have any meaning to it. Where if I say the color red to you, you're immediately going to think red or whatever. But if you show me something that has much more meaning to it, right? Like it's a red apple, but that red apple is specific to my own personal experiences because I've got something tied to it. But you were to show that to anybody else, wouldn't do the same thing. Like it's almost like we operate on our own, even though we have like a communication system, we also have our own personal communication systems where certain specific things are going to trigger a different part of us. And it's our emotional language, actually, I suppose, that we all we might run off the same system, but we're calibrated differently. So for it to have any type of impact, I imagine it would have to operate off of something very fine-tuned for an individual. It's just interesting that it happened to be him.
Well, this is my theory. My theory is that a minimum, when he was on the ranch, this non-human intelligence, it sort of knew who he was. It knew his connections, right? At a minimum. And then it's going, okay, what are we going to do here? And there's been other incidences where people have had, they've seen a UFO and then they hear a sound from their childhood, like an old tractor that they haven't heard since they were 10 years old. And it's actually making that sound. So it's somehow getting into their memory. It's able to, so at least it can do that. But I think it also knew who he was. But I don't think it took a chance. I don't think it was like rolling the dice, hoping something would happen.
Right.
I think it knew if the hitchhiker can leave the ranch and follow people around to the point where, these families where there's other kids in the school where the kids go that have it. If it's got that capability, it's following him. It knew what it was doing. It set him up. He had an ontological shock over this.
Right.
He really struggled with it, but it sort of set him up. It set up Brandon. And now we've got this lab where we've got how many 30 cameras on the ranch, all this instrumentation.
Oh, more. I think it's like 45.
So now we've all been set up because at any point this non-human intelligence could do something else. If it can do Lakatsky, it can do, and there's going to be a lot of cameras and a lot of data. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And the other data, the other data point for me is the Shermans, right? They had all kinds of crazy stuff happen. Where did that all go? There was years in the Bigelow era when there was almost nothing happening on the ranch, right? They were sending in the fake faxes, supposedly, right? I mean, maybe there's data out there, but You've heard those
Yeah.
stories, right? But you also have to admit that even today on the ranch, they haven't seen a skinwalker in years.
Yeah.
An actual physical skinwalker, right? But why is that? And is it setting us up for something even bigger at some point?
So I have theories on stuff. I don't want to speak for anybody else. I do know that like during Bigelow's era, I've heard firsthand stories from people like Chris Bartell, and he's a great guy you guys should talk to. He's got a very interesting take on it and a lot of obviously firsthand experience. And to go to the point of like the ranch, knowing that Lukatsky was there, we saw it this season with Jay Stratton showing up and the data points that correlated with his arrival and leaving, right? Like they showed, Travis said, I'm going to use you as a guinea pig. And then they showed him there being an actual reaction. So, I mean, that sort of plays into what you're saying. And now, yes, there's all of these cameras and where's the I've heard people be like, well, nothing happened before. Well, maybe nothing happened before, maybe something did happen before. I mean, it could be people didn't talk about it, or how do we know that people aren't like Bryant, who is a deterrent for stuff like that? I don't think can be like the saying of being like, oh, nothing happened there before, because those specific people might not have had happen, not the Shermans, but the people before him. So I think to talk about the Skinwalker part of it, though, it becomes a little, I think that there's a huge native story to this that we don't spend enough time with. Something I'm not entirely comfortable even trying to talk about in fear of being misinterpreted as disrespectful by any means, because that's not my culture. But I think it's something that we should be paying attention to, because I mean, we saw, for example, this season, like the stone circle lighting up, or we see historically petroglyphs in places that have these spirals that we know stuff is happening in. And I've talked about this before on, which is, I think about the nuclear, it's like nuclear warning architecture, where people are trying to figure out how to warn future generations. Like if the world burns down, basically, and they still need to warn people way in the future where we've buried nuclear waste so they don't get hurt. How do they make hostile architecture? Right? Like people literally plan out something called hostile architecture so that they can convey a message for that spot that something has happened there. And so I do sort of take that idea and apply it to the native history and these markings and the spirals and things. Like, was that just for them? Is it a message for us that we're supposed to be able to interpret, like, in now that we're in the future? But I also think about Ali's work and Keel a little bit, which I don't know how I feel entirely about. I'm not set in my ideas on it, but I think the idea of messaging in a personal way could come across in any way. And so the Skinwalker story is local to the land. It's local to the indigenous people that are there. The message of the Skinwalker would be very, very clear for people that might inhabit that land, if they're familiar with the stories of it. I'm not sure how applicable it is now, because we've moved so far away from the native history of the land, even though they are bringing it back some. So that's a question that crosses my mind as to whether or not it's, is it similar to like the tubular bells thing, for example? Is it a way to be some sort of communication of instilling fear because they're trying to warn you off of a specific place, like this is dangerous? What would be the best way to convey hostile or instill fear in you? And then it kind of runs with whatever the stories around the area are. I don't want to call it folk, but the belief systems. So I don't know. Those are some of the things that I've wondered. But you also go back to the stories about for lack of a better way of describing it, a skinwalker showing up in some of the stories off ranch, right? In people's yards. And so that's a curious thing. Is it an extension of kind of the narrative that's already been placed because the message is still going to be the same? Or is it an actual manifestation of some non-human entity that's choosing to show up like this? Or is that, I mean, it's kind of a lot. You could ask a ton of questions surrounding that specifically.
Yeah,
I think it would be interesting if like the story was different. Like if the story were some other creature, is that what would be seen? Meaning if the Indigenous story was a different creature, would that be what's seen? Because that's the memory kind of the land holds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if they had, Native American on the team, someone who is there all the time, would they start having more experiences that kind of tie in with that? Going back to the symbolism, the remote viewing program, they figured out that there were symbols involved, and it took them a while. They kept different remote viewers would get the same symbols. Like one was a inverted V, and they said, if we see this, we kind of learned that it represents religion. They didn't know why. They had theories about it, but it was in there. Like the symbol was already in there and meant this. And so maybe there is this kind of universal symbolic dictionary, again, in the collective unconscious or something, that the phenomenon is trying to communicate with us. I don't know why tubular bells would be in there, but it got the effect maybe that it wanted, which was Lakatsky going to the Pentagon and bringing this to everybody's attention and everything that came out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think tubular bells being tied to The Exorcist, and The Exorcist being such a huge, like that movie is not new. And my father told me stories about like creepy things that happened around The Exorcist, like it like tapped into for my father at least, I know, just sort of socially, the conversation that happened around that movie, and really diving into like religion and possession and sort of playing, I think, off of religious fear as well. It's considered to be like a very classic horror film, that even then we know that like on the set of the movie that stuff happened. So I mean, it has a lot of that specific film has a lot of weight to it. So I'm not sure, can we remove tubular bells from that? And is that part of the messaging that like that something else can possess something, that something needs to be exorcised out of a place, that it can be, I mean, that really kind of opens a box of other questions. If I'm not sure that we can remove the tie between the two, if we know for a fact that like it's the tubular bell and then it's intrinsically kind of tied to this film, because stories are so important to not just us now, but just traditionally, like throughout human history. Like we kind of survive on our stories. So if we do start paying attention to maybe some representations being pulled from stories that are culturally important, we might find some of the answers to the symbolism there. I don't know.
What I find interesting is so the stories retold in Skinwalkers of the Pentagon, for anyone that wants to actually read the story. But so it's the tubular bells, it's the Exorcist, which you said at the time was a huge cultural shock phenomenon when it and so he goes back to the Pentagon, and what's the end result? There's all these generals that remember the Exorcist, and they're saying the phenomenon is demonic.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a quick way to... In the Pentagon, everyone's like, oh, it's demonic, and you can see there's sort of a case for that potentially. But I think the entity, this non-human intelligence, sort of set us all up. It set Lakatsky, it set up the Pentagon. So there's this whole demonic thing, and that's continuing to play a part in this even today with disclosure. There are still a lot of people on the other side in the Pentagon that believe this is demonic, fundamentally demonic.
And whenever I hear that, part of me, probably a larger part of me, tends to go back to the idea of like that hostile architecture, almost like a hostile story representation, where it's just like perhaps it's just not something we're supposed to be messing with in protection for ourselves, like when we're talking about geographically, maybe with the ranch. Because the idea of a wormhole being there, something like that, is there a way to literally scare people away from it? And also keep things from, I mean, I don't really know, but I hear demonic or the Skinwalker, and that's, to think about that, like the Skinwalker plays on the fears of the indigenous people that are there. The Exorcist plays on the fear of basically the general population in sort of like America, when you're talking about the religion being such a huge thing here. And so it's very easy to just be like, demonic, stay away from it. Right? Because like, how else are you going to mess with the psyche? Because if it was weaponry, I don't feel like that would be enough to scare the people off, because we're like, oh, we would be able to physically fight. But when you start playing on literally like this spirituality, the good versus evil, God versus the devil, demons versus angels, when you start messing with that, you're reaching a whole different level of kind of like fear that a lot of people just carry around at a simmer, right? Like, so I don't know. It does make me wonder if it has more to do with sort of trying to give the message of like, back off, stay away, rather than it being anything else.
So people are getting hurt at the ranch,
Mm-hmm.
which is a pretty
are.
strong communication. I mean, Thomas, I gather that was a life-threatening situation.
People are getting hurt at the ranch, yes. And people have been getting hurt at the ranch. I mean, if you go back to like the Bigelow era, I mean, again, the stories are out there, and it's real. I mean, people are actually getting hurt. So the question is like, is the warning, are these representations of these imagery, is that a warning so that you won't get hurt, or are those warning shots when people are getting hurt, because it's not enough to kill them, but enough to really hurt them or mess with them or put some sort of fear into them? And yet we persist, and then we televise it. I mean, we're like, I don't know, we're just going to keep moving forward. So I do wonder, like, are we going to, as things ramp up, as stuff gets closer, are we going to see more of that? Or I don't know. I feel like intention is a huge part of it too. I think that's one of the things that frightens me about the whole conversation around government involvement and all of that stuff. Not to say anything other than just like historically, and for good reason. I mean, I think I can realistically look at the world and understand that like we have different governments and we're different countries and we operate in different systems and we have to protect ourselves and we've got the army and all of that stuff. Historically, though, we tend to figure out a way to weaponize anything. And so that makes me very nervous. I think that that's a real, when you've got people involved, and not just anybody involved, when there's the potential of discovering or unleashing something, I think in the back of my mind, I do always worry about that. Certainly not something to the extent in which I'm panicked by it, but I think realistically, it's smart to have in the back of your mind. I also think it's really funny when people are like, the government is eavesdropping on the ranch. Like there's these helicopters and all this stuff. Cause I'm like, man, if there is a wormhole, if there's something weird happening there, don't you want our government to know what's going on? I mean, they're not dropping in and taking it over, but like as a taxpayer, I would hope that they'd know if some property had a wormhole on it, just in case. So like that's not a bad thing to me. That's just my opinion on it, though. Yeah, I mean, who knows if they're dropping it, but I hope so. I mean, I hope they're not messing with anybody, but like, don't you kind of hope that like the government would know if stuff was happening in our country that could potentially be like a wormhole or like some huge phenomena? I would feel a little ticked off if they didn't. Like, what are they doing then?
So are you talking about some kind of a response team nearby that's listening to them at all the times. And if something weird happens, they get in a helicopter, or they
I
want
don't
to
know,
rush to the
maybe.
portal as soon as it opens up, that kind of a thing.
Well, it's funny because like there's good reason to think that that the helicopters are just like sightseeing. I mean, it feels like a waste of money, but if people are interested in it and they're able to do a flight over the ranch, great. Then I think it's interesting because the conversation has come up where it's like, well, are they assessing the land in case there needs to be drop points? If something happens and they need to drop in, a military presence needs to be there, how would they do that if they're not familiar with the landscape or what's happening? So that's an interesting thing to think about. The idea of the government listening in, like, it just doesn't sound frightening to me. Like, fine, I don't like there. Nobody's on the ground like trying to physically hurt anyone. As far as I know, they haven't gotten any. I mean, as far as I know, and I don't know everything, but I haven't heard of any like threats that have been made to them. I mean, the ranch is in a way protected because it's been in the public. Like, there's not going to be a good way to do something to somebody there and not make it quite obvious. So, I mean, I think if I'm looking at all of those possibilities, sure, maybe it's sightseeing and maybe it's also doing some sort of assessment of the area. I don't know. I just would think that like somebody's shooting rockets off and literally trying to discover whether or not they have a wormhole on their land, we should want the government to be aware of it. That's all I'm saying. And I know that's a very unpopular opinion. It's also a lot less like dramatic as like, oh, the government is listening in. Like, you want them to, don't you? I mean, I don't know. I would think. Maybe that's just me though.
Well, this is
So
probably a good time to mention that on the Skinwalker Ranch subreddit, we were contacted by
this is a great time to mention it.
one of the crew members associated with the Chinook helicopter flights over the ranch.
Yeah.
And they said it was basically because they're fans of the show, and it was kind of on the way back from where they were, which they couldn't talk about. And they were like, and we just wanted to kind of check it out.
I bet they loved watching it.
That was one flight. That doesn't mean that's true for all the flights, but they did provide us with evidence that, we were like, okay, yep, that
makes total sense to me.
They are who they said they are.
I mean, that makes total sense to me because the show has a ton of people that watch it. If I had the opportunity by way of helicopter to do something like that, I probably shouldn't say that out loud, but I like.
One of the only ways you can visit the ranch is to fly over it. And you shouldn't, by the way.
Yeah, don't do that.
Don't try and trespass on the ranch or anything. They take it very seriously, and they'll call the police, and you'll get in trouble.
For good reason. I mean, I suppose if you're in a military helicopter, you don't have as much to worry about if like a rocket's coming up or something. I think that could be dangerous for you. So, I mean, that makes total sense to me. That they're not doing anything far. It makes great television, though. But I imagine the guys that were in those helicopters watching the episodes that they were in and being like, I bet you that's why they were hanging out the back of them that one time too, being like, they're gonna see me on this show. I can just imagine it. Because again, if the military wanted to do something covert, they're not gonna do that. Like, right? Or we are in trouble if that's covert. For our military, we're in big trouble. That's all I'm saying. It seems like, I don't know, they knew they were filming too. It's not like it's somebody with their phone, it's a camera crew. Like, they were obviously filming out there. They were obviously doing stuff. So that's not to say that there isn't other stuff that's going on that we're not privy to. I don't know, but yeah. I also think it's funny that it's happened more than once because it feels like that conversation probably occurred, which is like, we flew over the ranch. And so the next guys are like, oh man, let's do that this time. And then it's happened. And now they're in the show. Also, if you're not supposed to be doing it, that's a good reason to keep quiet about it. Right. So they have Reyes on, and Reyes is like, I couldn't find anything out. Well, like, yeah, because you're not going to tell your boss that you took a detour you weren't supposed to take. I mean, that's common sense, I feel like, but you know, I'm
Yeah.
just not against the idea either of it being like, if the government wants to start listening again, like maybe that's okay, as long as nobody's getting threatened or hurt or like they're trying to shut them down or anything like that. Um, I think that's sort of where like the conversation about the eminent domain thing from the bill makes me curious, because if they discover something, does that mean that the government can come in and take it?
You're talking about take the ranch away from Brandon, effectively.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to put that out there as being a possibility, but like, is that what the bill means? Like, what's written in there? Let's say they find some nuts and bolt craft within the mesa or something like that. Does that mean that the government can come in and exercise eminent domain over it? Because that's what it sort of seems to read like. Um, so again, the ranch is in a may have the upper hand there though, because they're very public. There wouldn't be a good secret explanation for that, if suddenly the government came in and took the ranch. I think we'd all have to acknowledge what it was over. We're like, okay, well, that's all the confirmation that we need. Like, you can't exactly secretly exercise eminent domain over a public space like that. Like, oh, they finally figured out what was in the mesa. I don't know.
But of course, once the story changes and the government acknowledges UFOs are real, these things are real, it wouldn't need to be secret anymore. They could just say, oh yeah, the ranch got a UFO. It's ours. We're taking it. They don't have to give out any details, but they don't necessarily need to keep that secret.
I wonder what that would look like in practicality, though. So the mesa doesn't belong entirely to the ranch. Like, there's that campground that's there. Um, they own a portion of it, but like the entirety of it doesn't belong to them. And I am interested to see how in the future, in practicality, what that would look like if anything was found anywhere. What is that going? What is it going to be like? Close Encounters, where they like set up a huge, like, and nobody can go in or out? Or are they just going to like show up with some trucks? I mean, it's going to be interesting to see if it eventually happens, not just with the ranch, but with any place, I suppose.
Is it possible that the phenomenon is making the people on the ranch not drill into the mesa effectively? Is there a reason why it's taken them this long to not get down to whatever is in there? I mean, the people on the subreddit are constantly like, why haven't they blown that thing up with dynamite?
Well, one thing is that they don't own it. They only own part of it. If you literally look at the map of the ranch, the majority of that mesa does not belong to them. And so you can't just do that. Also, if you're trying to get to something, it would be, and you don't know what it is, it'd be very unwise to blow something up, because then you could potentially blow up anything else with it. I think this season was really interesting because it does seem, the way that the drill bits are coming back out, it does seem like it's hitting something that's not actually there, though. It almost feels like it's a force field type deal, that it could possibly be like hitting something and not being worn down. I think that they probably don't drill when they're not filming, and drilling takes a long time too. Because, like, God forbid they drill and they're not filming and something's discovered in the off season. And I think people don't realize that they're only shooting for like 4 months out of the year. So if you're and it's brutally hot, not that that's a great excuse, but it kind of also, you're talking about like having cameras on it and dedicating this amount of time to it. And while people think that that's the most important thing, then what do you choose to do to neglect everything else? Like the stuff that's in the triangle or above the triangle area, which from what I understand, a lot of time wasn't even necessarily spent with that area prior to Fugal taking over. I mean, there's a ton of interesting things that are happening, and people are focusing on just whatever could potentially be in the mesa. But like, what if the possibility exists that whatever's in the mesa is some sort of, I don't know, effectively like how we would describe like a Wi-Fi box, that it's affecting everything else too. So if you're going straight for that, what if you shut down everything else? It does seem like there's some sort of connection between everything, that there's got to be some sort of like everything's sort of operating together. Because when we look at the LiDAR scans, at Pete Kelsey's LiDAR scans, at all, and you start to layer imagery, you can see where there's like, it seems like it's all connected. So I don't know.
Let's talk about that LiDAR for a minute. This is one of the great thing about the insiders, because of course there was all this talk in the subreddit about the LiDAR and whether there was a shadow beneath it. But if you go on the insiders, this question was raised and it was addressed very directly on the well, I guess I don't know how much I can talk about this actually.
I think you're fine. I think it's fine.
But basically the allegation had no merit. It didn't.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, in insiders, we do raise questions and people can work out answers to things, but then it does give us the benefit of having more information than is put out there. And that's for a few different reasons. Again, people have to start separating the show from the actual investigation. The show is documenting an investigation. It is, but it is so incredibly limiting to what is actually occurring and all the information that's there. They are given an hour each week. This season, we're getting 14 episodes. I think they're doing some sort of bonus thing at the end, from what I understand, where they're going to review some other stuff. I don't know if that's for certain, but I think that they are. I think that's what I was told. So we have like next week's, whatever the 14th episode is, to sort of review over the season. But that's such a that's literally 14 hours of time for 4 months of filming. Like, I don't have to explain to someone how that's a huge difference in time, like amount of time that's shown. And one of the benefits of the Insiders program is, in fact, getting a bunch of questions answered that I think, if you're seriously watching the show, linger in the back of your mind. I also hope that if people are seriously watching the show, that they are able to discern between like what a full-blown investigative research looks like versus a television program that is marketed to lots of different people that really might just watch it for fun and they don't want to ask tough questions, or like, this is just a really interesting, like we like that guy that shows up in Rocket City Rednecks. We're gonna watch it on the ranch show. Like, there's a lot of different reasons people watch the show, and it has to be palatable to a huge. I mean, that's part of literally the entertainment industry. Like, you have to make it interesting to a wide variety of people, and so unfortunately, that removes the time to discuss things that explain these questions, like people saying it's a shadow in the LiDAR scan or whatever. All of these things you could take singularly, and I could see where people might try to come up with an explanation for it, but you can't do that. Like, you have to take it in totality, because that's what an investigation does. And when you start layering these maps and you start taking into account all of these other things, the argument to make it so simple, it falls apart very easily. And the idea that Omnitech, of all people, with Lance Lord, who used to literally be Space Command for the US government, or Royston, involved with the ISS. These are people that are not only good at what they do, but they're so good at what they do, they have moved up the ranks to some of the highest possible positions that we've got in our country. And these guys are there and they're saying that this is what's happening, and they're putting their names behind it. And if you can't look at experts like that and trust that they're not trust that they're not trying to get something out of it for some, like, there's no purpose. Once you reach that level of your career, what are they trying to do? Become famous on the History Channel? That seems like that's not, we're looking at employees. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's other ways to do it. That's not the way to do it. So I don't know. I think not to discredit people that become famous on History Channel. It doesn't make any sense. The logic of it doesn't make any sense to me. Instead, I like to view it, and I think it makes the most sense to view it, as these guys have reached the top of their careers and they have now been presented with something that's challenging to them, because that's what people do when they are good at what they do. They are constantly looking for a challenge to make them better at what they do. And you don't get to where you are in positions like they are in by not being that type of person consistently. And so now they're in a place that there's a challenge. I mean, that's what it appears to be to me. I mean, so much so that Brandon's sitting on the board now and they're on the ranch, right? That's a huge partnership to have. Or the guy with Lunasond, who's like a savant. He's a genius, that kid. The guy that came in that did the balloon that went up and he's like 20, he's like in his early 20s and is, so highly regarded in his field. And again, the idea that he would need to use something like Skinwalker Ranch as publicity for his business so that he could go on and show that he doesn't have data seems really unwise. Like, that's not a good marketing tactic as far as I'm concerned. Like, I would say it's very unwise. Or the drone guys, those drone guys, that's what they make a living at. Who's gonna, like, it's just, somebody was just telling me that those exact guys did this big event at New Year's, and one of the things had to be a QR code showed up in the sky that people could like scan, which is by itself just weird to think about. I don't love the idea of that. But nevertheless, it happened. And you just think about how like QR codes are so sensitive to every little spot. So it's not a great look for them to show that they have drones that fail, because who would trust and hire them to make a QR code if there's a possibility of having drones fail? Because then there'd be things that are out of place. I don't know. It's just like in all of these people, all of them, it just doesn't make any sense that would be the case.
Right. Well, in the case of this lighter that we're talking about, just for those that don't remember exactly, I'm not sure exactly what episode it was in, but basically,
so we had one that was done with Pete Kelsey and then another that was done with Omnitech. So Pete Kelsey came at the beginning and did LiDAR, where we show it kind of not where it's supposed to be. But I think the one that was just referenced with people saying it's the shadow was the one from Omnitech.
Right. So Omnitech did their experiment. They got the hole, they got the rings, right? Mm-hmm. And then somebody who's a non-scientist, literally an amateur, goes in his backyard with his cell phone and some cardboard boxes and mimics something where there's a hole in the middle because he put his iPhone on a tripod. So it's a no-brainer. He's not going to scan below the tripod. And so the accusation was, well, that's what they did. But yet on the insiders group, they said, nope, the drone actually moved around and the LiDAR pointed down and scanned the ground. Right. So, and apparently they did the experiment twice. The first time they got the hole with the rings. The second time, nothing. It was fine. And Brandon says it's transient. He does a face palm and says, this is another transient thing. But yeah, what everybody else thinks is this amateur non-scientist on his iPhone, is basically proven that the whole thing was a scam and these guys are grossly incompetent and, that whole list. And then there's a whole legion of, flying monkeys out there that, follow this guy. And it's all based on lies. It's not the truth. That's not my issues with it. Is not the truth.
Yeah, well, it's not the truth, and it's also based on literally an episode of a television show. Like, they're not getting everything in the background. I see a lot of the data, and I am still uncomfortable even making any type of, because I still don't know the whole picture. Like, to think that you could draw any type of conclusions from what's being shown on a television show, just, I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Can we do it? Can we have this uncomfortable conversation about the data? I tried to talk to Brandon Ernie about it. He's got a very strong opinion about the data. But I want to talk to you because you're sort of like the data manager to a lot of extent, because you sort of watch the spreadsheet, right? You handle a lot of the data.
I handle a lot of the data that's insider collected. And then I've seen some other stuff.
So yeah. Can I ask you, how does Eric actually store the data? Is he got it in a database so that it could easily be transferred to the insiders? You know, he got everything in like a folder where he could just say, here's everything on 1.6 gigahertz. Here's everything on this, all the scans. Do you know how he stores the data? Is it in a database? And is there some kind of a plan in place now that at some point more of that raw data will be packaged in a way that the insiders would have access to more and more of the data? The reason I ask is because of crowdsourcing. You've got all these brilliant, smart people, get them under NDA, get them in a trust environment where they're not going to try to use the data to prove some lame point that's not true. But can you tell us a little bit more about when are we going to actually see the data, and how is that going to happen? What's the state of the data now?
Okay, so I know that there are plans in the future for things changing a bit. I don't specifically know what those plans look like. I know what the goals are in mind. I'm hesitant to speak on them in case stuff like that doesn't pan out, but I know that that what you're describing is essentially the same as what Eric has described, in terms of like, there are a lot of very bright people. To me, it makes sense. I think it was a great idea to have a bunch of people that are enthusiastic to watch the live cameras collect data, because that is a daunting task if you're doing it every day. Like, not one person at the ranch should be sitting there just watching cameras all day. So the fact that now they're crowdsourcing people to collect data off the cameras, it was great. And I think that's a great first step. I don't know specifically how. I know that Eric has his own system, and I know that he can pull things however he wants to. My guess is that stuff is extremely sort of encrypted. I also know that there's a transition that's happening sort of behind the scenes on stuff, because again, Omnitech has come in. I don't know how that affects how they're storing things. As far as like sharing stuff with the insiders, I think that becomes complicated because, again, 99% of our insiders are fantastic, but we have had, there are some bad actors that pop up every once in a while. And so I think that becomes a little maybe nerve-wracking to think about releasing data to everybody through the program. I don't know what that's going to look like in practicality. I wish that I had that answer, but I would definitely defer to Brandon and whatever he said. I don't want to say anything incorrect.
Okay, but what's the fear? What's the fear of releasing the data? I'm going to hypothesize you're going to have a bad actor that takes the data and uses it to prove that there's all BS, right? Isn't that like worst case scenario, that someone's going to like misrepresent the data? But other than that, what's the fear of letting the raw data be, but at least to the insiders? If there's 1% bad actors, what's the worst that could happen?
I don't know. I honestly can't speak to their feelings on it. For me, if I was the one that was doing it myself, I think my only fear would be that not everything can be quantified. So while there might be quantifiable data, it might be losing a large portion of non-quantifiable data, which is the qualitative data that occurs within people's personal experiences, which then become, you can't exactly call that science. I think that becomes really difficult when we're having this conversation, is because to me personally, and this is not a representative opinion of their stuff, that the thing that's most fascinating about the ranch is not everything that we can see on scans. I mean, that's what we've been talking about. It's the stuff that's in stories, like Lukatsky seeing his vision, or people having these disembodied voices, or stuff that's only showing up to some people. And it has to work in tandem with the quantifiable data. And so I feel like for me personally, that would be very difficult to only hand over a piece of the story that makes sense when you're telling the entirety of the story. I'm not sure that's an excuse though. Like, that's my personal opinion. I can't, this is not something that I ever even thought about until I started hearing people being like, show us the data, show us the data.
Well, and they
I
have
think
very
maybe because that's not my forte necessarily.
well, and they have specific requests, like why can't we get the lidar data of the column above the spiral? You know, that anomaly, or when
They did release some.
did
They
they? Okay.
released something this year because the lidar data that Pete Kelsey released is out there now, and that was the first set of data that they released, where it's like you can go in and I mean, I think Brandon posted it first, and then Pete posted it, and I'm sure it's circulating somewhere, where it's literally like you go to the website and you can put in a bunch of different. We actually did a podcast on understanding how to read that lidar data. Pete, it was on the. Is it okay for me to say another podcast name?
Oh, of course.
I don't know how. Okay.
No, yeah.
So on Jay Free 906, we did a podcast that was Jeff, Pete, and I believe Seth Bridges, and it was basically a tutorial on how to access the lidar data and how to understand it, just from like a basic level, not like in a way that's sort of directing people any sort of direction, but like people that aren't really familiar necessarily with how to understand lidar data or how it works or any of that. And I think there's a description of where to find that. And that was a big deal for them to release, because just from a safety perspective, you're looking at basically a 3D map of the ranch. And again, there's been people are sometimes very overzealous about their belief, the blurriness of the line between the ranch calling to them and them needing to come to that call is the only way that I can describe it. So, but there is that data that's out there. The other stuff I don't know. And they didn't get any of Bigelow stuff either. So
right. But he had a huge database. A big part of OSAP was creating this massive database.
Yep.
And
I
it
know.
seems like the ranch could do the same thing. It seems like the ranch at some point can have a massive, wonderful database.
I'm sure that they have something similar to that. Because again, from what I understand, like the spreadsheet and all of that stuff, which that spreadsheet was developed when we had like 50 people, and now we've got over 8,000. So like that was never meant to be our database. That was just sort of like a band. Like, I don't know if it's necessarily a band-aid, but it was just sort of like just a holding. And I know what I've been told repeatedly is that that's not going to stay, which I'm super grateful that we were able to have that we have this shared space, but realistically, we do need something bigger and more robust and more like data, like being able to search and all of that stuff. So I know that something's going to be happening with that. Will that be combined with their stuff? I don't know. But for the insider data, we have so much of it that I do foresee, and I hope that it is moving to something bigger or better.
So where do you see yourself going with this? Like, how would you like your role to continue with the ranch, or?
That's a great question. I don't know. I didn't anticipate my role being what it is. I had zero. Again, I still think about that first day when I got to talk to Eric. I have a screenshot of it from that day because I was like so excited. I couldn't believe it. And I still can't. And I feel very privileged, but I didn't anticipate it becoming what it's become. I didn't anticipate like becoming a moderator because I have never done that. I don't know if I'm even a great personality type to be a moderator, but I am enthusiastic about helping people, and I'm enthusiastic about the work that they're doing. And I feel really privileged that I've been able to develop relationships with, our community and with the team. I've learned so much from conversations that I've had with Eric, and everybody's been very kind to me. I have no idea what this is for me personally. I've been trying to figure that out. And I think for me, it's leading towards me continuing to watch people engage with the phenomena and what that looks like and how we have a conversation around it. I think that's where it'll take me eventually. That would be my goal, is to be part of finding sort of like that scale of when people are having actual experiences versus perhaps having psychiatric experiences. I think that that's something that we never talk about. And I've learned in this last year that it's an important conversation that we need to be having if we want to get good information and we want to safeguard people. I think that's something that I've learned from this past year or two, is the need for safeguarding. We talk about, again, disclosure. We talk about this huge thing and we're all interested in it, but there's a whole bunch of people that aren't. A lot of people aren't. And I know that there's this whole kind of imagery around like, oh, if stuff is disclosed, then banks will collapse and churches will burn and like all of this stuff. And I certainly don't think so. But I do think that we need to have some sort of serious conversation about how we safeguard specific vulnerable individuals from degrees of ontological shock, because it's not going to be one size fits all. For some people, that might be a breaking point for some sort of mental illness. And if we are not realistically having this conversation, then we're failing our brothers and sisters that we share this planet with, I think. Because there will be individuals that I'm not saying are the ones that are going to try to, make society collapse. But there will be people that are sort of psychiatric casualties of it all, because we know that there can be some sort of catastrophic event or trauma or something that can trigger something in someone's head. And so if we're not even having the conversation among people who are having experiences in a healthy way, then how can we possibly imagine how we're going to handle people that might be more vulnerable to this sort of stuff? So I think being in the position that I've been in and having exposure and conversations with our members, our community, in varying degrees, I've been given a unique gift, which is to have a sample of individuals. Granted, these are people that are interested in it, but it's still it's a decent sample in terms of like variabilities among personality types and backgrounds and other moving parts in the background. So I hope to do something with that, because I think ultimately, as interested as I am in things that are out there, at the end of the day, I really care about the people that are here and how we have a relationship with what's out there. So I don't, and it would be cool if I could do a study on the guys, but I don't think that's ever going to happen.
A study on the guys? You mean on the
like
ranch team?
Yeah, on the team. I don't know if that's ever going to happen.
So you brought up the guys. So can I ask you this question? We've asked this of other guests.
Please.
What's it like being a woman in this field?
That's a great question to ask. For me, it's something I'm proud of, in the sense that, like, I'm glad to be a sort of a represent, because there's a need for it. I think that it kind of happens naturally at this point. unfortunately, this is like, things are starting to change, but it's just, this is where we're at. And I do hear that a lot from other women, saying that like there's no female representation. And then it goes back to Candace, and yes, she is female representation. But yeah, it gets, I mean, for me watching the show, I would be lying if I didn't say that there weren't moments where I've been frustrated in the past, but prior to the Insiders, of being like, why aren't there any women on the team? Because I think just perspective wise, there's different sort of how we engage in things can be different. I also think it's really interesting, and I don't know this because I don't have the actual data on it. I'm not sure that I can get it either, but it does seem like we've talked about this some, even though I don't have the numbers, that it looks like the Insiders program is more female than it is male. Now, it's hard to know if that is the actual case because females tend to be more vocal, so they might be posting more stuff or like in the voice chat more often. But what's represented in our program is the representation of gender demographic is much higher in females. And so I think that's interesting because traditionally we hear like, oh, this is a male dominated field, but women are also interested in it. So I think the Insiders is a great place for women to start, like also knowing that they can come in, because yeah, even when I've done like podcasts and things, it's generally, I'm the only woman on, which I'm proud of. It's a good thing. I don't know. I just think the conversation, I think not just women and men though, I think the conversation has to extend to different, cultures and races and things. I think to not have a conversation about stuff that affects all of humanity without involving representative humanity seems unwise, in my opinion, because again, it almost feels like we're trying to put together a puzzle, but all the pieces are on different trains and we're blindfolded and we don't know what the picture looks like. And I think it's going to take everybody to try to start finding their pieces and like bringing it to the table. And so I do think that it's important for there to be more kind of representation in the conversation. But I also think it'll naturally happen as it is. I mean, I hope so, at least. I'm optimistic.
Well, I want to thank you so much for spending all of this time with us today. I mean, this was an amazing conversation. And you've got a lot of great perspective on not just the program, but the ranch and the people involved and the phenomenon itself. And I want to thank you for all the work you've been doing on the Insiders group as well.
Well, I'm happy to. I'm glad that it's made the program. I hope that it's aided in making the program what it is. It's something I'm in a weird way proud of, I guess, because I can't take credit for things because it's the community really that's done everything. If I've been able to help in any way, it certainly hasn't been just me. So it makes me happy to hear that people are enjoying it and they're getting something out of it. And I loved hearing that people feel welcomed and that, if we can create a safe space for people to have conversations that feel uncomfortable in other places, that's a wonderful thing because I don't think there's enough of that. So thank you for having me. Hopefully sometimes I ramble, so I hope I make sense most of the time.
That's what we do. We let you guys talk. We don't really have a whole lot to say, but we've got a lot of questions. We have to field a lot of issues on Reddit. Every day we're moderating Reddit. So we get a lot of questions and a lot of the questions we end up having to answer or help people answer. And I'll tell you, what we're doing is nothing compared to what you're doing, Shannon. What you're doing is actually changing people's lives. And the other thing, The other thing I can tell you is, I've been on Reddit for a while. I've been chatting with people for a long time. I still don't know how to talk about this subject. I don't know how to do it. And I don't think a lot of people can, especially after what happened with the hearings. I woke up the next morning and I felt like I was in a different reality. It's almost like waking up after election day and your candidate didn't win, right? That feeling you get, like, I now live in a new universe, or like Happy New Year. You wake up New Year's Day and it's a new year. I felt that way, and I didn't really know how to talk about it. And I don't think a lot of people know how to talk about it. What we need desperately is role models.
I agree with that.
And I think you're an excellent example of that. So thank you.
Well, that's so overly sweet. Thank you. I wasn't expecting that. I don't know how to take that, but thank you very, very much.
You got to appreciate the fact that we can't normally have these kind of conversations off this podcast. One of the reasons we did this podcast is because we wanted to have that conversation and just talk about it and listen to people. And,
Well, thank goodness, because I mean, I'm grateful that you guys do. And I thank you for asking me to talk to you.
Great. Well, we'd love to have you come back anytime if you ever want to talk about anything. I have one quick question for you at the end, though. A lot of people are saying they're feeling like something big's going to happen by the end of the summer, some kind of a big disclosure. Maybe it's already happened. And then something big in 2026. A lot of people are saying those. Are you hearing that, or are you feeling that, like something is imminent this summer?
Well, it's funny because I was just thinking about this today, actually. That's really funny that you say that. So that was brought up to me a couple of months ago by one of my friends. They were like, I've been hearing that it's supposed to be like some big thing this summer. And part of me goes back to, I don't know if this is a good thing or not, but, I go back to, like, historically, people always feel like they're on the precipice of something. So it's really kind of leaning back and being like, are we actually, or do we just feel like we are? But this week was monumental in terms of stuff happening. I mean, like, this is a very big deal. Like, we can't, whether or not people believe it to be fact, means almost nothing when you're talking about what actually occurred. Like, you don't have to believe it to be fact to acknowledge that it is a big deal that it happened. And we are in a new world with it. And it's not just ours, it happened on our soil, but, like, seeing people globally reacting to America having this congressional hearing, it's really funny because I've seen, like, videos and things of people in other countries being like, why aren't Americans freaking out like all of us are? And it's like, I think we are. We're just, I think the conversations are happening. So for me, if you had asked me 6 months ago if last week was going to happen, I would not have been able to predict that. So there is no way for me to say something. I mean, can you imagine what it'll be like in 6 months or a year or 2026? My goodness, it could literally be anything. They talked about some very heavy stuff at this hearing. And so let's say 100% of it is factual and it's all based in fact, just to play devil's advocate. Then that means that there is non-human biologics sitting somewhere.
Now we're not talking about food or a plant. We're talking about bodies.
Yeah.
They say that word and it's like, what? We're talking about bodies.
Yeah. And so 2026 seems like a realistic timeline, though, if you're talking about rolling ontological shock and dosing people with information. I'm not gonna lie, I think people will get really upset about that being sort of like the course of action and how stuff is done. But from, like, a psychological perspective, that's the best way to do it if you don't want to, like, really mess people up. Not for everybody, but I think for the majority of people, that's the best way to do it. So is it possible that in 2026, why 2026? Is there some sort of, like, astrological, like, is there some planetary thing happening then? Or is that just, did somebody remote view this? Is this from, like, what source is the 2026 from?
I know one, Chris Bledsoe. Do you know Chris Bledsoe?
I actually know Chris Bledsoe. Yeah.
Okay. So, he's talking about 2026 and it was a star rising over
Oh, okay.
He's
Okay.
got
It's
he's
really
got his
funny.
thing,
So
yeah, in Easter of 2026.
yeah,
But
yeah,
that's just
yeah.
one example. Charles, I'm sure you know of other examples, right? Of this 2026 timeframe.
Well, I've kind of wondered how many of them trace back to Chris Bledsoe, but other people have hinted at it. Leslie Keane has hinted at it.
So,
Elizondo has made some claims where he's like, we got to wait 5 years. Then you've got people like John Ramirez, who's a little more frank and kind of
okay.
odd. He's a former CIA agent, if
Oh
you aren't
yeah,
familiar
I've
with
heard
him. And
about Ramirez.
yeah, and he's like, oh yeah, the phenomenon is going to disclose itself within 4 or 5 years, is what he's saying.
So not to get off topic at all, even though we're off ranch, Bledsoe, I had never heard of Chris Bledsoe until one of our mutual friends, who's an insider or was, I don't know if he's still involved or not, asked me if I wanted, we were talking about something and asked me if I wanted to participate in what was described as a quantum entanglement thing with him and Chris Bledsoe. And I didn't know who Chris Bledsoe was. And I'm really fearful of ever front loading information. But because I was interested and I'm open minded, I was like, sure. And I've just gotten to the point now where I will say this publicly because I haven't really talked about it at all. But that first night that we went outside and we were in different locations, but we were connected to each other, Chris Bledsoe, my friend David, and myself, I saw things and I have not stopped seeing things. And Chris has been, although at a distance, anytime that we've done them and together, these quantum entanglements, it seems to be more of whenever he's on the line. But since that first night where it's occurred with him, it's never stopped. And I used to go outside all the time and look up all of the time. And so, with that being said, I again, in fear of being front loaded with anything having to do with any of this stuff, I haven't read any of Chris Bledsoe stuff. I don't know. I know about Chris from my own interactions, but I don't know about his story outside of tiny bits and pieces that have been told to me. So it doesn't, the Easter thing I think sounds familiar. I hadn't heard the date of 2026. And I'm definitely not going to sit here and say that, from my own experience, I mean, stuff happened. I can't say that it didn't because it did, and it will never not have happened. And it has since continued. And this has been since September.
What do you see?
Which has been,
sorry, what do you
what
see?
do I see? We have seen or lights. So we get these flash bulbs that sometimes are very low or high, orbs, for sure, orbs, which I'm not even sure orb was in my vocabulary prior to a year ago. So we've seen that stuff. We've seen stuff that I would describe as, I call them swimmers, which I didn't realize was like a way that they were described previously, but it the first time I saw one, it reminded me of watching the movie Nope, which made me very uncomfortable, but that's what it felt like. It was like you could see something right, and it was low enough where you could see it, and it was definitely not an animal, but it was very fast, and it was almost like it's almost like if you would imagine like an animal in the water breaching the top of the water is how I would describe it. Which is why I called them swimmers, because it literally looked like it was just sort of breaching whatever we could see. And several. I mean, it's not like one or two, it's several. Previously, I've been a little hesitant to say, I've stuck to this part of being like, I'd never seen these lights before that night. I had stuff happening that it's really hard to describe, but the stuff that I've seen with Chris has been has a different feeling attached to it than some of the oddities that have happened with the ranch, even though the timelines kind of overlap. So there has been stuff that's happened that I would attribute to the ranch outside that I would not say is of the same nature as the stuff that I've seen or began seeing with Chris as being like sort of, I guess, the middleman. I don't really know. I don't know what to just, I don't know what role he plays in it, but he does, he does, I guess. I don't know. It's such a bizarre thing that when I tell you that I had zero expectation, like, and my poor husband, I'm like, do you want to do this tonight? He's like, okay. Like zero expectation. He's such a good man to be along for the ride. Because I'm just like, I don't know. They say that maybe we'll see stuff. And again, I had no idea who Chris Bledsoe was. This was prior. I knew this was prior to the book and all of that stuff. But I guess people knew who he was prior to the book and stuff. I didn't know who he was. For all I knew, this was an insider, my friend David, who I had good conversation with, who was like, hey, my friend Chris sees these things. Why don't we? And I was like, sure, why not? So no, I had no clue. I had no clue what I was getting myself into. And so yeah. And now we go outside. It does not matter when we go outside. And I'm just gonna say this for anybody who's watching. We have multiple apps that tell us where our satellites are, our constellations are, our airplanes are, everything, because I am one of those people that likes to double check, because it's hard to believe. It's still hard to believe. But then when you have stuff that are low and in your trees, like, for a fact that that's not a satellite. You can't confuse that. Yeah. So very, 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 very strange stuff. That kind of, it's like a switch got turned on, whatever that night was. And I mean, I've had the privilege of being on like a WhatsApp chain with him simultaneously. Well, myself and David and him will go outside, and I mean, we've sometimes had other people participate, and we'll all start sharing like when we're seeing things. So I don't question that he's got stuff going on. I just don't know. I'll have to ask about the 20. As soon as we're done, I'm going to be sending a text message to say, tell me what's happening in 2026. I try not to read this stuff. So
please do. He's going to be on the next episode of Beyond Skinwalker Ranch. I understand this next week.
I know.
So I'm really excited for that. So that's fantastic.
I remember when they were filming it, and I could not say anything. I think I'm allowed to say something now, I hope, because the cat's out of the bag. But yeah, I remember when I was being told that they were going to go do it, and I'm very curious as to what comes from. I kind of know, but I don't know I never know what's going to end up in a television edit. My original background, my husband is an actor, and my original background's originally in film. So unfortunately and fortunately, I understand how like editing and all of that stuff works. And you do too if you have to edit for things, but especially when it comes to TV. I hope that, people seem to be responding really well to Chris's story. I've been surprised by the reception. I also have felt a little dumb too, to know that people, like, when people bring up the book or like him, I feel like, oh, I should have paid better attention and like maybe been more educated about who this person is. But at the same time, I also think it's good to try. It negates all the comments from people, at least from me personally, of being like, if it's a social contagion, how does that actually play into it if you don't know what it is? Right? Like, if I'm not front loading myself with information, how is this naturally emerging then? So I've just now gotten so kind of comfortable in some of this stuff where I'm reading more about things because I can feel solid in my own background. But anyways, I took that way too far. We were saying goodbye, and then I went off on a complete tangent, and I apologize. I'll have to look it up. 2026. Okay. Yeah, that's soon.
It is. It's coming up fast. I'll be curious to know what he tells you, if you can share any of that with us. We'll stay in touch.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, and don't apologize. Like, we love this stuff. We would go for another 3 or 4 hours, but
Yeah.
we know that you've got a limit, and you know, our viewers probably have a limit as well. And they'll tell us, you know, and we ask them to, by the way. Everybody, tell us in the comments if you know, if you like what you're watching or whatever. But people are watching it, so they seem to like it. So, but
makes me nervous. The comment section always makes me very nervous. Hopefully,
I don't think we've had to remove any negative comments.
That's good.
I think it's all been very positive.
That's good.
That's good. Dean's the one who really oversees that. So
it's overwhelming.
Say anything.
Yeah, it's overwhelmingly positive. Overwhelmingly positive.
That's good. That's so encouraging. I think that there is room for kindness and discernment. I truly do. I think there's a way to be a kind skeptic too. Like, I feel like that's where the conversation is like, you can be skeptical. No one's saying that you can. You just shouldn't be horrible about it. That just, I don't know. Some of the people can be unnecessarily nasty, which is really unfortunate. So, anyways.
Well, knowing you're a student of psychology, I was just going to suggest you should look up the common traits between the dark tetrad and pseudo-skepticism.
Oh, yeah.
It's a pretty tremendous overlap.
It is. And that's why I grant a lot of grace. I think it helps to try to understand the psychology of things. It still sucks sometimes.
You're telling me.
Well, you're like, I understand it, but I don't like it.
No. Yeah, I had to learn all about it, you know, being a moderator and trying to understand it and arguing with pseudo-skeptics myself, and eventually being like, this is a giant waste of my time. There are genuine skeptics out there. They're few and far between. But and I think that's because a lot of them actually take the time to investigate it and then go, oh, there's actually evidence for this. And tend to move a little bit more towards the believer side, but they keep quiet. I think that's what happens.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Well, it's their own changing of how they view their entire world. So I think that's okay. I don't know. Yeah, moderating is a tough job. Moderating on Reddit is a different beast, though, you guys. That's like that's an unseen circle of hell, I think. Reddit is not. Reddit is a
one
deep,
step
dark
above YouTube
place.
comments. Yeah.
I don't know. I would say Reddit is like that's the scariest place. I tried to dip my toe in there and I was like, nope, this is not for me. This is scary as heck. So I commend you both for doing that. I definitely would not be able to. I could never do what you do. So thank you. It's a huge job.
Well, we're getting really well paid.
Are you?
No.
I always tell people when they're like, they should give you a raise, I'm like, they can double my pay.
Yeah.
But
well, thank you again. This was great. And we'd love to have you back on at some point.
Of course. Yeah. That would be lovely.
Yeah. Well, we'll see you online.
I'm always there. I'm always there. And I will send messages if I hear anything about 2026.
Yeah. Likewise.
I have some questions I need to ask as soon as I'm done with this. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, take care.
Bye.